Midnight Cat is here beside you once more, moving softly through the quiet rooms of the night. Settle a little deeper beneath the blankets, and let the modern world fade beyond the window. Tonight, our path leads far from electric lights and paved streets across more than 2,500 years to a warm plain beneath a vast Mesopotamian sky. There, beside the slow waters of the Euphrates, rises Babylon, a city of temples, markets, gardens, workshops, canals, courtyards, and gates glazed in colors bright enough to catch the morning sun. So rest now, and come with Midnight Cat into the ancient world, where one ordinary day is about to begin. But before dawn reaches Babylon, there is a small mystery worth carrying with us. What was it actually like to wake in a city whose name would become a legend? Kings left inscriptions boasting of walls, palaces, and sacred buildings. Scribes filled clay tablets with accounts, contracts, prayers, astronomical observations, and lists of goods. Archaeologists, many centuries later, would uncover foundations and fragments beneath the earth. Yet between the royal monuments and the surviving tablets lived thousands of people whose mornings began not with history, but with bread to eat, work to finish, water to fetch, errands to remember, and streets already warming beneath the sun. For them, Babylon was not a lost city. It was home. In the darkness before sunrise, Nabu Ramani opened his eyes. For a while he remained motionless on his sleeping mat, listening. His house seemed to breathe around him. Somewhere below came the faint scrape of pottery against plaster. A door hinge murmured. From a neighboring courtyard, a donkey gave a sleepy, indignant sound, and was answered by another farther down the lane. The air was cool, though Nabu Ramani knew it would not remain so. He sat up. The room was small and plain, its walls coated with pale plaster over mud brick. A low wooden chest rested against one side. A folded wool garment lay upon it beside a reed basket containing several clay tablets. Near the doorway stood a shallow lamp, its oil exhausted during the night. The house belonged to his father, a merchant who dealt chiefly in wool, dates, and sesame oil. It was comfortable by the standards of many Babylonian families, though no visitor would have mistaken it for the residence of an official or a wealthy landowner. Like many houses in Mesopotamian cities, it turned inward. The outer walls presented little to the narrow street beyond. Inside, rooms opened around a central courtyard where much of the family's daily life unfolded. There, people cooked, worked, talked, repaired tools, prepared food, and sought shade when the afternoon became oppressive. Nabu Ramani descended the stairs. His mother was already crouched beside the hearth. A reddish glow showed beneath a little fuel as she encouraged the fire back to life. Smoke rose lazily, carrying with it the familiar smell of yesterday's ashes. A servant girl lifted the lid from a pottery jar and poured water into a basin. Nabu Ramani washed his hands and face. He was perhaps 24 years old, though nobody in the household had celebrated his birthday in the modern sense. He worked as a scribe for a merchant whose business overlapped with the enormous economic world surrounding Babylon's temples. Writing had given Nabu Ramani a life different from that of most laborers. As a child, he had learned to press a reed stylus into damp clay, making the wedge-shaped marks now called cuneiform. The signs could be frustrating, numerous and complicated, but mastering them opened doors. A trained scribe might record deliveries of barley, loans of silver, marriages, property agreements, wages, leases, and commercial partnerships. Babylon ran on clay nearly as much as it ran on water. His mother handed him a piece of barley bread. It was dense and slightly coarse. He ate it with a little date syrup and a few pieces of onion. There was nothing ceremonial about the meal. The family spoke quietly about a shipment expected near the river and about the rising heat of recent days. Above them, the eastern sky slowly changed color. In the courtyard, darkness softened into gray. Then came the first distant sounds of Babylon waking. Doors opened. Footsteps entered the lanes. A man somewhere nearby called to an animal. A woman shook a woven cloth from an upper doorway, sending dust drifting down into the street. From much farther away came sounds connected with a world larger than Nabu Ramani's neighborhood, voices and movement from the direction of the river and the principal streets. Babylon stood in southern Mesopotamia, in the land the Greeks would later call Babylonia, surrounded by an immense flat plain shaped by the Euphrates and Tigris river systems. The landscape lacked the abundant forests and stone of other regions, but it possessed something more important: fertile soil when water could be properly controlled. Generations of farmers and laborers had maintained canals, embankments, and irrigation channels across the countryside. Water made grain possible. Water fed date palms. Water carried boats. Water also threatened fields when canals broke or rivers shifted. A Mesopotamian city could never forget the importance of managing it. Nabu Ramani tied his garment, placed his small personal seal securely inside a pouch, and stepped into the street. At once the household vanished behind him. The lane was narrow enough that the walls on either side seemed almost to lean inward. Their surfaces showed the muted browns and ochres of mud brick. Doors interrupted the walls at irregular intervals, but there were few windows facing outward. Babylonian houses guarded their privacy. From within came domestic sounds: grinding grain, sweeping, babies stirring, jars being moved, someone coughing beside a cooking fire. The street beneath his sandals was hard-packed earth mixed with generations of dust. He turned toward a broader road. With each junction, the city became busier. A baker had begun arranging bread for sale. Nearby, a porter walked with a bundle balanced across his shoulders. Two boys hurried past, carrying a basket between them. A man led a small group of sheep toward another quarter, and their hooves made a soft, irregular tapping as they moved. The smells accumulated quickly: warm bread, smoke, animals, damp clay, onions, reeds, river water. Bitumen, used throughout Mesopotamia as a waterproofing and construction material, added its own heavy scent in places where boats or masonry were being repaired. Nabu Ramani knew these smells so well that he scarcely noticed them. To us, they might be the perfume of another age. To him, they were simply morning. He entered one of Babylon's larger streets as sunlight began touching the highest walls. Now the city revealed something of its scale. Ahead moved merchants, laborers, temple personnel, servants, craftsmen, farmers who had entered from surrounding lands, and travelers whose clothing marked them as strangers. Some carried baskets. Others drove animals. Donkeys transported loads that would have exhausted a person on foot. Babylon, under Nebuchadnezzar II, had been reshaped by enormous royal building projects. The king, who ruled from 605 to 562 BCE, restored temples, strengthened fortifications, rebuilt palaces, and monumentalized the city in a manner intended both to honor Babylon's gods and to proclaim royal power. But Nabu Ramani did not need an inscription to tell him that. He could see it. Far above ordinary roofs rose sacred architecture. Somewhere beyond the dense neighborhoods stood the great temple complex of Marduk, Babylon's chief deity, and near it the towering ziggurat remembered in ancient sources as Etemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. Its exact appearance remains uncertain to modern scholars, but its scale must have dominated parts of the city. For Nabu Ramani, however, it was not a mysterious ruin or a subject of excavation. It was part of the skyline. He continued walking. The morning light strengthened, turning the dust golden, and then, as the street opened toward one of Babylon's ceremonial spaces, he glimpsed something that even lifelong residents could hardly ignore. Blue. A deep, shining blue against the earth-colored city. The glazed bricks of the monumental gateway caught the early sun, and upon them moved the raised forms of sacred animals, lions and bulls, and strange dragon-like creatures associated with Babylonian divine imagery. Nabu Ramani slowed only slightly. Ahead lay the busiest part of his morning. Beyond the gate, beyond the temples, beyond the processional road, the Euphrates was already carrying boats through the heart of Babylon. And, waiting somewhere beside the river was a merchant who would be deeply displeased if a certain shipment of wool had arrived without the correct tablet. By the time Nabu Ramani reached the river quarter, the coolness of dawn had almost vanished. Sunlight spilled across the upper walls and struck the pale surfaces of buildings with growing force. Shadows remained long in the narrow lanes, but along the open quays the day had already begun to shimmer. The Euphrates moved through Babylon with a broad, unhurried dignity. Its water was brown beneath the morning light, carrying reeds, scraps of vegetation, and the occasional floating branch. Along its banks, boats rested against wooden landings or nosed carefully between other vessels. Some were little more than working craft for short journeys. Others had come from farther away with cargoes piled beneath woven coverings. Nabu Ramani stopped near a warehouse and looked for the mark he had been told to expect. The quay was crowded. A porter bent beneath a sack of grain. 2 men rolled jars carefully from a boat onto dry ground. A donkey protested as its load was adjusted. Nearby, a fisherman crouched over a basket in which silver-scaled fish still moved weakly among wet reeds. Above everything came the voices of merchants, not shouting constantly, as one might imagine in a theatrical marketplace, but negotiating, calling names, counting quantities, asking questions, and occasionally raising a complaint when some measurement failed to agree with what had been promised. Babylon was a city of splendid monuments, but its greatness depended just as much upon scenes like this. Grain arriving, wool departing, oil measured, silver weighed, debts remembered, documents checked. No coin passed casually from hand to hand in the way it might in a much later city. Silver served as an important standard of value, often weighed rather than used as minted currency, while many transactions involved goods, obligations, credit, and carefully recorded agreements. And everywhere there were tablets. Small pieces of clay could preserve astonishingly ordinary concerns. A quantity of barley owed next month, a field rented for a season, a house sold, a marriage agreement, a delivery of dates, the names of witnesses, the impression of a seal. For modern historians, such tablets would become tiny windows into ancient lives. For Nabu Ramani, they were paperwork. He found the merchant at last. Beliddin was standing beneath a reed awning beside 3 large bundles of wool. His expression was not cheerful. Nabu Ramani immediately understood why. There should have been 4. Bel-Idin pointed toward the bundles and then toward the boatman, whose own expression suggested that the morning had already lasted far too long. The missing bundle, it seemed, had not vanished at all. It remained at a smaller landing upstream, where another consignment had been unloaded by mistake. The greater difficulty concerned the tablet. The delivery record listed the correct total, but the clay envelope that should have accompanied one part of the consignment had been damaged. A corner had broken away, taking several signs with it. Nabu Ramani accepted the tablet carefully. Clay was durable once dried or baked, but not indestructible. He turned it beneath the light. The surviving lines gave names, quantities, and a date according to the Babylonian calendar. Enough remained to establish the general transaction, but Beliddin wanted a new record prepared before the wool entered storage. This was where a scribe earned his breakfast. They moved into the shade beside the warehouse. A worker brought fresh clay, damp and cool. Nabu Ramani kneaded it between his palms until the surface was suitable. Then he took a reed stylus from its case. For a moment, the enormous city disappeared. There was only clay, his hand, the angled end of the reed. He pressed the first wedge, then another. Cuneiform writing was not drawn as flowing lines. The signs were composed from impressions made by the stylus, combinations of wedges whose arrangement carried sounds, words, numbers, and meanings inherited from a writing tradition already ancient in Nabu Ramani's own lifetime. His movements were careful rather than quick. He recorded the merchant's name, the quantity, the type of goods, the circumstances of the replacement record. Bel-Idin watched impatiently, though he understood enough about scribal work not to interrupt. When the text was complete, witnesses were called. One was the boatman. Another was a warehouse employee. The appropriate seals were impressed into the clay. Nabu Ramani used his own cylinder seal, rolling it gently across the soft surface so that its carved design appeared as a continuous image. For him, the seal was practical. Yet he always felt the smallest sense of satisfaction when the pattern emerged cleanly. His grandfather had owned it before him. The stone had crossed the surface of documents long before Nabu Ramani had learned his first signs. Perhaps, he sometimes thought, objects remembered families better than people did. The matter settled. Workers carried the wool into the warehouse, and Bel-Idin's mood improved immediately. Nabu Ramani remained by the river for another task. A shipment of sesame oil had arrived in large pottery containers. He checked the quantities against a separate record while the sun climbed higher. The smells of the quay grew stronger with the heat. River mud, fish, sweat, wool, oil, bitumen, dates from an opened basket nearby. The sweet fragrance of those dates almost made him hungry again. Babylonia was famous for its date palms, which thrived where irrigation supported them. The palms gave not merely fruit but shade, fiber, timber of limited use, and materials woven or worked into everyday objects. Beneath their canopy, other crops might grow in the carefully managed agricultural landscape beyond the city. To the people of Babylon, the countryside and city were never truly separate. Every loaf of bread in a household depended upon fields. Every jar of beer began with grain. Every temple offering came ultimately from labor performed somewhere beyond monumental walls, and every canal demanded attention. From the quay, Nabu Ramani could see boats arriving with produce from estates connected to temples, officials, wealthy families, and private entrepreneurs. The city consumed constantly: food, fuel, reeds, textiles, animals, building materials, workers, information. No matter how magnificent its gates appeared, Babylon could not eat glazed bricks. By mid-morning, the river quarter had become too hot to linger comfortably. Nabu Ramani finished his accounts, placed the tablets into a basket destined for Bel-Idin's office, and stepped away from the quay. He chose a route that would take him toward the sacred center of the city. The change was gradual. Warehouses gave way to workshops and houses. A potter's yard opened behind a low entrance, where newly shaped vessels waited to dry. From another building came the steady sound of tools against wood. He passed a weaver working where light entered from a courtyard. Dyed fibers hung nearby. Textiles were among Mesopotamia's important products, and wool passed through many hands before becoming a garment. Shepherds, washers, spinners, dyers, weavers, merchants, and administrators. Behind each fine robe worn by someone important lay countless hours of ordinary labor. Nabu Ramani knew this because he had recorded some of those hours. He turned into a street where food sellers clustered near a crossing. Here the smell changed again. Bread baked against hot surfaces. Onions softened in a pot. Someone had prepared a stew whose aroma carried coriander and perhaps garlic into the street. A seller had arranged cucumbers and other produce beneath shade. Another offered dates in several qualities, the best dark and glossy. Nabu Ramani bought a small portion of bread and paused where the wall of a building cast a narrow strip of shadow. Nearby, two older men discussed the price of barley with the seriousness of astronomers interpreting an omen. A child chased another child around a water jar until a woman ordered them away. A dog slept beneath a bench. Flies drifted lazily through the heat. It was an ordinary Babylonian morning, and this, perhaps, was the strangest thing about Babylon. A traveler seeing its monumental gates for the first time might stare upward in astonishment. A foreign envoy might remember its palaces for years. But people still misplaced goods. Children still ran where they were not supposed to. Dogs still searched for shade. Merchants still worried about prices. Someone still burned the bread. Human life remained stubbornly small beneath grand architecture. Nabu Ramani finished eating and continued toward the city's ceremonial heart. The street widened. Traffic thickened. Temple personnel became more common among the crowd. And, gradually, rising beyond roofs and walls, Etemenanki seemed to grow larger with every step. The ziggurat was associated with Marduk's sacred precinct, and later traditions would surround Babylon's great tower with stories far removed from the everyday experience of those who lived beside it. Nabu Ramani knew none of that future. He knew only that the tower belonged to the sacred geography of his city. Its immense mass stood between earth and sky. He had passed it countless times. Still, there were mornings when its scale drew his eyes upward. Today was one of them. Perhaps it was the unusually clear light. Perhaps it was simply that he had nowhere urgent to be for the next few moments. He slowed beside the entrance to the great temple precinct. Around him, Babylon continued moving. But beyond the gateway, in courtyards touched by brilliant sunlight and deep shade, another rhythm governed the day. And Nabu Ramani, carrying a small message for a temple administrator, stepped quietly inside. The temperature seemed to fall the moment Nabu Ramani passed through the gateway. It was not truly cooler, perhaps, but the thick walls and shaded passages of the temple precinct softened the sun. The noise of the street also changed. Donkeys, merchants, and wheels became distant, replaced by footsteps on packed earth, quiet voices, the brushing of garments, and the occasional echo of activity from courtyards farther inside. Nabu Ramani paused long enough for his eyes to adjust. The sacred precinct of Marduk was not a single quiet sanctuary isolated from ordinary life. It was an enormous institution, one that required administrators, craftsmen, laborers, scribes, cooks, guards, priests, suppliers, storekeepers, and people responsible for managing fields, animals, goods, and offerings. Religion and economy were woven closely together. To enter such a place was therefore to enter both sacred space and a working world. A man carrying a basket of bread passed Nabu Ramani without looking at him. Behind him came another with jars that probably contained beer or oil. A scribe sat in the shade near a doorway, his knees drawn up, inspecting a tablet while a younger assistant waited beside him with fresh clay. Nabu Ramani recognized that posture immediately. Someone was explaining something badly. The older scribe looked at the tablet, looked at the assistant, and then looked back at the tablet with the weary patience of a man reconsidering every decision that had brought him to this moment. Nabu Ramani almost smiled. Some difficulties were universal. He continued across the courtyard. Above the surrounding structures, Etemenanki rose into the brilliant sky. Modern knowledge of Babylon's great ziggurat is incomplete. Ancient texts preserve measurements and descriptions, while archaeology has revealed parts of its enormous foundation. Reconstructions differ in detail, and we should resist imagining that every painted image of the tower represents exactly what a Babylonian saw. But its presence was undeniable. For someone standing near its base, the massive brickwork must have been immense. The tower belonged to a tradition older than Babylon's Neo-Babylonian kings. Ziggurats had risen in Mesopotamian cities for many centuries. They were monumental religious structures, built in stages, connecting the horizontal world of streets and fields with a sacred architecture that seemed to climb toward the heavens. Nabu Ramani did not think of it in such distant historical terms. He simply tilted his head. The upper levels were bright in the sun. A few birds circled high above them. Then he remembered the message in his pouch and went in search of the administrator. The man he needed, Marduk Shuma-Iddin, worked in a room attached to a series of storage and accounting spaces. He was seated beside several baskets of tablets when Nabu Ramani arrived. The room smelled of clay, dust, and reed matting. Shelves and containers held records whose importance ranged from substantial property matters to transactions that would appear almost comically minor to anyone expecting ancient archives to contain only royal decrees. That was one of the quiet truths of Mesopotamia. People wrote things down, thousands upon thousands of things. A loan, a ration, a purchase, a debt, a field boundary, the hire of a worker, the ownership of a house, a quantity of wool, an inheritance disputed among relatives. The ancient world becomes strangely intimate when its paperwork survives. Nabu Ramani handed over Bel-Edin's message. Marduk Shuma-Iddin read it slowly. The issue concerned sesame oil promised for a temple-associated transaction. The shipment had arrived, but a discrepancy in the containers required confirmation before the account could be closed. The administrator asked 2 questions. Nabu Ramani answered both. Then the man nodded, placed the tablet beside 3 others, and turned immediately to another problem. The meeting had lasted less than a minute. Nabu Ramani had crossed half the city for it. This, too, was familiar. He stepped back into the courtyard with nothing urgent left to do until later in the afternoon. The sun stood high now. The safest wisdom in Babylon at such an hour was not to invent unnecessary errands. He moved toward a shaded colonnade and sat near the wall. For the first time since dawn, he allowed himself to be still. People passed in ones and twos. A temple worker swept dust from a threshold, though there appeared to be considerably more dust outside the threshold than before he began. A young boy delivered a small basket and departed. 2 men carried a wooden object between them, walking slowly to avoid striking a doorway. Somewhere nearby, bread was being prepared. The smell reached Nabu Ramani and reminded him that he had eaten very little. Food associated with temples could be elaborate in ritual context, but the daily nourishment of most Babylonians remained grounded in familiar staples. Barley was fundamental. Bread appeared in many forms. Beer was a common beverage and an important part of Mesopotamian food culture, though its precise varieties and methods changed over the long centuries of the region's history. Dates provided sweetness. Onions, garlic, leeks, legumes, vegetables, fish, dairy products, fruits, and occasionally meat formed parts of the broader diet according to wealth, season, occupation, and circumstance. Nabu Ramani's own midday meal would be modest. He left the temple precinct and found a shaded vendor near the processional route. For a little silver reckoned by weight within the larger accounting system, or by arrangements of small-scale exchange familiar to customers and sellers, food could change hands without ceremony. Today he bought bread, a handful of dates, and a portion of cooked lentils. He carried them to a place where an awning cast a wide patch of shade. Nearby sat a boatman whom he vaguely recognized from the quay. Neither man felt obliged to speak. The lentils were warm and earthy, seasoned enough to make him thirsty. The dates were soft and intensely sweet. He ate slowly and drank water from a small cup. Beyond the shade, sunlight lay across Babylon like a sheet of white gold. Traffic had diminished. Anyone who could arrange work around the fiercest heat often did so. Labor did not cease, of course. Boats still moved. Bakers still baked. Animals still required handling. Construction projects did not vanish merely because the afternoon was uncomfortable. But the city's rhythm slackened. Even the dogs had abandoned ambition. One lay on its side against a wall, breathing slowly. Nabu Ramani leaned back. Across the road stood an impressive building facade, but his gaze drifted beyond it toward the blue-glazed magnificence of Babylon's ceremonial architecture. The famous Ishtar Gate belonged to a monumental northern entrance connected with the processional way. Its surviving glazed bricks, excavated many centuries later, would become among the most recognizable remains of ancient Babylon. To Nabu Ramani, its imagery carried meanings rooted in the religious world around him. The bulls were associated with Adad, the storm god. The strange composite creatures often called dragons by modern observers were Mushushu, linked particularly with Marduk and other deities. And along sections of the processional way, lions represented Ishtar. In the bright Babylonian sun, these animals seemed to advance across walls of blue. Nabu Ramani had seen them since childhood. He remembered being very small, holding his father's hand while crowds gathered during the New Year festival. That memory came without invitation. He could not have been more than 6 or 7. He remembered almost nothing of the formal ceremonies, but he remembered shoulders pressing around him, incense in the air, adults trying to see over one another, and his father lifting him briefly so he could look along the processional way. For a moment he had been higher than everyone. Blue walls stretched ahead. Lions passed beneath him in orderly rows. The city seemed endless. His father had told him not to wriggle. That was what remained most clearly. Not the theology, not the king, not the rituals later scribes might describe. Do not wriggle. Nabu Ramani smiled faintly at the memory. A city preserved itself in such fragments. The great monuments might outlive everyone who walked beside them, yet human memory preferred a father's tired arms, the taste of a date, a crowded road, and the impossible height of being carried on someone's shoulders. A warm breeze moved beneath the awning. Dust rose and settled again. Somewhere toward the river, a man called out twice. Nabu Ramani closed his eyes for only a moment. When he opened them, a shadow had fallen across his feet. He looked up. A boy of perhaps 12 stood before him, breathing hard, with a small clay tablet held carefully in both hands. Nabu Ramani? He nodded. The boy extended the tablet. It bore Bel-Idin's seal. Nabu Ramani read the first few signs, and the peaceful emptiness of his afternoon disappeared. The missing bundle of wool had finally arrived. Unfortunately, so had its owner. The owner was a man named Shamash Ariba, and Nabu Ramani knew enough about him to begin walking immediately. He left the shade reluctantly and followed the messenger back toward the river. The heat had settled heavily over Babylon. Even the broad processional way seemed quieter than before, its brilliant glazed animals watching over a city temporarily subdued by the afternoon sun. Shamash Ariba was not, strictly speaking, the owner of the wool itself. Ownership in Babylonian commerce could become complicated. Goods might belong to one person while being transported by another, financed through an agreement with a third, and delivered to a merchant acting on behalf of still another institution. Silver could be advanced for a journey. Profits might be divided according to contract. Witnesses and written records existed partly because memory became remarkably flexible when valuable property was involved. Shamash Ariba had supplied the wool. Bel-Idin had agreed to receive it, and somewhere between those two simple facts, trouble had grown. By the time Nabu Ramani reached the warehouse, he found both men standing beneath the reed awning. The fourth bundle lay between them. Bel-Idin had folded his arms. Shamash-Eriba had folded his arms. The boatman stood several paces away with the expression of someone who wished very much to be on the Euphrates. Nabu Ramani understood at once that nobody had solved anything. The dispute concerned the weight. The newly arrived bundle appeared smaller than expected. Its binding was intact, but Shamash-Eriba insisted that the wool had been properly weighed before shipment. Bel-Idin insisted that what stood before them could not possibly match the quantity recorded on the original tablet. Neither man accused the other directly of dishonesty. In Babylon, as in many places and ages, there were more elegant ways to suggest it. Nabu Ramani listened. Then he asked for the weights. A worker brought a balance and a set of standardized stones. Weights and measures were essential to Mesopotamian trade, though practical systems could vary across periods and contexts. Silver, grain, wool, and other commodities had to be reckoned in understood units if contracts were to mean anything at all. But standards alone did not eliminate disagreement. A damaged weight could cause trouble. So could a careless measurement. So could moisture. So could an ambitious merchant. They untied the bundle. Wool expanded beneath the loosened cords, pale and dusty, carrying the unmistakable smell of sheep. Nabu Ramani crouched beside it. The men began weighing portions. The first result favored Bel-Idin. The second did too. Shamash-Eriba grew quieter. Then Nabu Ramani examined one of the stones. Its surface looked ordinary, but when he compared it with another standard from the warehouse, the difference became apparent. The warehouse weight was slightly wrong. Whether through wear, damage, or some earlier error, it was lighter than it should have been. That meant the wool had appeared deficient because too many supposedly equal units were required to balance it. Bel-Idin stared at the stone. Shamash-Eriba stared at Bel-Idin. The boatmen looked toward the river. Nabu Ramani requested another set of weights from a nearby merchant whose measures were known to both parties. They repeated the calculation. This time, the recorded quantity and the actual wool agreed closely enough to satisfy everyone. The argument dissolved with surprising speed. Bel-Idin blamed the old stone. Shamash-Eriba blamed the old stone. The boatman, who had apparently blamed the old stone from the beginning without telling anyone, returned to his vessel. Nabu Ramani prepared a short supplementary tablet, noting that the consignment had been received and checked. Fresh clay was brought once again. He pressed the signs carefully. The afternoon seemed full of clay. He sometimes wondered whether the entire city would eventually become one enormous archive. Every household buried beneath records of grain, silver, wool, dates, fields, marriages, debts, and arguments about weights. He handed the finished document to Bel-Idin. His work was done. At last. The riverfront had begun to revive as the worst of the heat passed. Shadows stretched outward from awnings and walls. Boatmen returned to their cargoes. Men who had spent an hour sleeping in shaded corners stood, stretched their backs, and resumed whatever labor the day required. Nabu Ramani could have walked directly home. Instead, he remained by the Euphrates. A breeze had risen from the water. It was warm, but after the stillness of midday it felt pleasant against his face. He followed the quay southward at an easy pace. Babylon's relationship with the river was intimate and practical. The Euphrates was not merely scenery dividing one part of the city from another. It was a road of water. A loaded boat could move goods that would require enormous effort to transport overland. Reeds from marshy regions could travel along waterways. Agricultural produce could come from estates outside the city. Materials unavailable in southern Mesopotamia could enter wider networks leading eventually to Babylon. Mesopotamia possessed abundant clay and reeds, but good timber, Metal ores and many types of stone had to come from elsewhere. Long before Nabu Ramani's lifetime, cities of this land had depended upon exchange stretching across astonishing distances. Babylon inherited that ancient habit of connection. At one landing, a boat was being unloaded of long pieces of timber. Nabu Ramani paused to watch. Wood of useful size was valuable in a country where the natural landscape did not provide great forests. Cedar from the Levant had acquired particular prestige, especially for monumental and elite uses, though many other woods circulated through regional trade. The men handling these timbers did not appear impressed by their geographical significance. They were mainly concerned with not dropping them. One worker shouted a warning, another adjusted his grip. Together they carried a beam toward a waiting cart. Farther along, baskets of dates were stacked beside pottery jars. A man repaired rope beneath an awning. Two boys splashed water onto the dusty ground near a doorway, briefly darkening the earth before the sun began drying it again. Nabu Ramani continued. He came upon a small riverside shrine where someone had recently left an offering. He did not enter. Religion filled Babylonian life in ways both grand and quiet. The city belonged under the protection of Marduk in its civic identity, but households and individuals interacted with a broad world of deities. Shamash was associated with the sun and justice. Ishtar carried complex associations including love and warfare. Ea was linked with wisdom and fresh waters. Nabu, whose divine name formed part of Nabu Ramani's own, was connected especially with writing and scribal wisdom. Names themselves could carry devotion. To bear the name of a god within one's own was ordinary. Nabu Ramani had spent so many hours copying divine names that he rarely considered the intimacy of it. His father had chosen his name. His father, who was probably at that moment sitting somewhere in shade and asking why his son had not yet returned. Nabu Ramani turned toward home, but instead of taking the shortest lanes, he drifted into the market quarter. Late afternoon had transformed it. Morning urgency had softened. The light had become warmer, reaching beneath awnings and illuminating suspended dust. Sellers who had protected their goods during midday brought them forward again. A fruit seller called to passing customers. A potter rearranged vessels outside his workshop. A woman inspected a length of woven cloth, rubbing the fabric between her fingers before rejecting it with such finality that the merchant watched her depart in wounded silence. Nabu Ramani bought several dates for his younger sister. Then he stopped at a stall selling small household objects: needles, pins, combs, simple ornaments, tiny containers. Nothing was remarkable enough to deserve a royal inscription. Everything was necessary to somebody. He picked up a small bone hairpin. His sister had lost one recently and had accused the household dog, although there was little evidence that the dog had developed an interest in personal adornment. The seller named a price. Nabu Ramani answered with another. The seller looked offended. Nabu Ramani looked unconvinced. Eventually, they reached an amount both could pretend was disappointing. The hairpin went into his pouch beside the dates. He resumed walking. Above the roofs, the color of the sky was beginning to soften. The sun no longer seemed white but golden, and Babylon changed with it. Walls that had looked harsh at midday now glowed warmly. Long shadows crossed narrow streets. People emerged from houses and shaded workshops. Children reappeared as though released by the fading heat. Someone nearby poured water over a threshold. The scent of damp earth rose immediately. Nabu Ramani breathed it in. For the first time that day, he felt no obligation pulling him toward another place. No merchant awaited him. No administrator needed a message. No damaged tablet required replacing. The city itself seemed to relax. He entered his own neighborhood and recognized every doorway, every turn, every irregular patch of wall. Soon he would reach his family's courtyard. There would be evening food, questions about the wool, his sister's delighted discovery of the hairpin, and his father's opinion that the entire difficulty could have been avoided if merchants simply checked their weights more often. But as Nabu Remani approached the house, a sound from somewhere above the roofs made him stop. It was the beginning of a familiar evening ritual. Across Babylon, as daylight slowly withdrew from walls and courtyards, people were beginning to look upward. And tonight, the sky would matter more than usual. The sound came again, low and carrying, from somewhere beyond the neighborhood roofs. Nabu Remani recognized it as a call connected with observation of the evening sky. He remained in the lane for a moment and looked toward the west. The sun had not yet disappeared, but its lower edge was approaching the horizon beyond Babylon's walls. The fierce brilliance of afternoon had softened into copper and amber. Above the flat roofs, the sky stretched enormous and almost empty. Almost. Tonight marked the beginning of a period when trained observers would watch carefully for the first appearance of the new moon. To modern eyes, the matter might seem simple. A thin crescent appears. A month begins. But in Babylonia, the heavens were watched with remarkable patience. For generations, scholars connected with temples had recorded celestial events, appearances and disappearances of planets, movements of the moon, eclipses, unusual weather, and other phenomena, believed to carry significance. Astronomy and astrology were not separated in the manner familiar to the modern world. Careful observation of the sky existed within a religious and intellectual tradition in which celestial events could also be interpreted as signs. Nabu Remani was a scribe, but he was not one of those specialists. His knowledge of the heavens was practical. He knew when the moon should appear. He knew the names of several prominent stars. He knew that scholars could argue about a faint light near the horizon with enough seriousness to make merchants discussing barley prices seem carefree. Mostly, however, he knew that evening had arrived. He entered the courtyard of his house. His younger sister was sitting beside a basket, sorting onions. She looked up. Nabu Remani took the bone hairpin from his pouch and held it toward her. For several heartbeats she merely stared. Then the onions were forgotten. She hurried across the courtyard, took the pin, turned it between her fingers, and immediately began explaining why this one was considerably finer than the missing one. Nabu Remani gave her the dates as well. This produced an even greater improvement in his welcome home. Their father emerged from an adjoining room. "How much did that cost?" Nabu Remani told him. His father looked at the hairpin, then at Nabu Remani, then at his daughter, who had already placed it in her hair. He decided, wisely, that the transaction was complete. They sat together as the evening meal was prepared. The courtyard had become the most pleasant place in the house. Daylight still lingered above, but the walls were falling into shade. Heat stored in the bricks would remain for hours, yet a faint current of air moved through the upper rooms and across the open courtyard. Nabu Remani's mother brought bread and a bowl of cooked vegetables with lentils. There was also fish. It had been cleaned and cooked with herbs and onions, and its smell filled the courtyard. His father asked about the wool. Nabu Remani explained the missing bundle, the damaged tablet, the incorrect weight, and the eventual resolution. His father listened without interrupting. When the account was finished, he tore a piece of bread. The weight should have been checked. Nabu Remani had expected this. So, Belidin said. After it caused trouble. Yes. His father dipped the bread into the lentils. A man usually discovers wisdom immediately after kneading it. That appeared to conclude the subject. They ate. From neighboring houses came the soft sounds of other families doing much the same thing. A baby cried briefly. Someone laughed behind a wall. A clay jar struck something with a hollow knock. The smell of cooking fires hung above the roofs. If you could have sat in that courtyard beside them, Babylon's grandeur might have seemed very far away. The Ishtar Gate could not be seen. The palace was hidden. The ziggurat rose somewhere beyond walls and rooftops. There was only lamplight beginning to gather on familiar faces. That was another Babylon. Perhaps the more important one. The city of households. A merchant calculating tomorrow's expenses. A mother checking whether enough flour remained. A child hoping nobody had counted the dates. An elderly man settling onto a mat because his knees hurt. A young apprentice remembering a mistake at work. Thousands of private evenings unfolding behind mud brick walls. When the meal was nearly finished, Nabu Ramani's father glanced upward. The remaining light had faded. "Come." They climbed to the roof. Flat roofs offered useful living space in many houses, especially when evenings became cooler than enclosed rooms below. From above, the neighborhood opened around them in layers. Other figures stood on other roofs. Some families had brought stools or mats. A woman held a small child against her hip. Two men, several houses away, were already pointing west. The whole city seemed to have lifted its gaze. Nabu Ramani looked toward the horizon. The western sky remained pale where the sun had gone down. Higher above, blue deepened rapidly. One bright point had appeared. Then another. The air smelled of smoke and warm brick. From somewhere near the river came the faint creaking of a boat. Babylon, after sunset, did not become silent. It simply changed voices. Daytime traffic diminished. Animals settled. Workshops closed. Doors shut. Yet people still moved through the larger streets, and temple activities continued according to rhythms that did not depend entirely upon daylight. Nabu Ramani searched for the moon. At first he saw nothing. Neither did his father. His sister announced that she had found it. She had found a cloud. They waited. The first crescent after conjunction could be difficult to see, depending upon the circumstances. Babylonian observers took such matters seriously because the lunar calendar depended upon the moon's appearance, with procedures developing for dealing with uncertainty when observation was impossible. Nabu Ramani narrowed his eyes. The horizon seemed empty. Then a voice rose from another rooftop. Someone had seen something. Immediately, everyone looked in the indicated direction. For several breaths, Nabu Ramani still saw nothing. Then there it was. So thin that it seemed less like an object than a scratch made upon the fading sky. A delicate crescent. His sister saw it a moment later. The moon hovered briefly above the horizon, fragile and pale. Around them, Babylon watched. The sight was ordinary and ancient at once. Long before Nebuchadnezzar had rebuilt the city's monuments, people in Mesopotamia had watched the moon. Long after Nabu Ramani's household disappeared, others would do the same. For now, however, nobody on the roof was thinking about centuries. His mother had come up behind them. She shaded her eyes out of habit, although the sun was gone. Nabu Ramani's father quietly acknowledged the crescent. The new month would soon be formally established according to the practices of the time. Far away in the city, scholars would make more careful observations than this family did. Some would record what they saw. Clay tablets preserved from Babylonian scholarly traditions reveal an extraordinary long-term attention to celestial phenomena. Centuries of observations would eventually contribute to sophisticated mathematical astronomy, allowing Babylonian scholars to predict aspects of celestial behavior through numerical methods. But the beginning of that intellectual achievement was something wonderfully simple. Someone looked up, someone remembered, someone wrote it down. The crescent sank lower. Darkness thickened. Then, one by one, more stars appeared. Nabu Ramani remained on the roof after the others began descending. The sky over Mesopotamia could be magnificent on a clear night. Without modern electric light, darkness opened deeply above the city, though lamps and fires below still made their own scattered glow. He could identify a few constellations according to the traditions he had learned. Beyond those familiar patterns lay countless stars whose names he did not know. To Babylonian scholars, sections of the sky carried divine associations and inherited meanings. Some celestial bodies were linked with gods. Venus, strikingly bright at certain times, was associated with Ishtar. Jupiter had connections with Marduk. Mercury was associated with Nabu. Nabu Ramani sometimes found it strange that his own patron deity could be represented in a wandering light among the stars. Tonight he did not search for Mercury. Instead, he looked down. Babylon stretched around him. Lamps glowed through doorways and courtyards. The dark line of a larger street could be traced by moving lights. Farther away, monumental structures formed black shapes against the sky, and above them rose the great ziggurat. At night, its scale became difficult to judge. It seemed less like a building and more like a piece of darkness arranged into steps. Nabu Ramani watched it for a while. Somewhere within the sacred precinct, priests and temple personnel continued duties governed by traditions older than anyone living in the city. Offerings had been presented during the day. More rituals belonged to the night. The gods, Babylonians believed, required proper attention. The stability of the city, the king, the fields, the canals, and the ordered world itself existed within relationships between divine and human realms. Nabu Ramani did not examine those beliefs as a modern historian might. They were simply part of the structure of reality he had inherited. Just as the Euphrates flowed through Babylon, just as clay received the marks of a stylus, just as the moon returned. A sudden noise came from the lane below. Footsteps, several people. Then a knock sounded against the household door. Nabu Ramani leaned over the parapet. His father, already downstairs, opened it. A familiar voice entered the courtyard. Bel Eden. Nabu Ramani sighed. Even beneath the stars, apparently, commerce could find him. He descended, but Bel Eden had not come with another damaged tablet. His mood was unusually cheerful. Tomorrow, he explained, a caravan delegation from the west was expected to complete a substantial transaction involving imported goods, and a senior scribe who normally handled such matters had fallen ill. Bel Eden wanted Nabu Ramani present, not merely to copy a record, to witness the negotiations. For a young scribe, it was an opportunity. His father understood this immediately. Nabu Ramani did too, he agreed. Bel Eden departed after only a short visit, leaving the household with the news. Nabu Ramani returned to the roof alone. The moon had vanished below the horizon. Stars filled the space it had left. Tomorrow would bring foreign merchants, unfamiliar goods, complicated accounts, and probably several people insisting that their preferred measure was the only sensible one ever invented. But that belonged to tomorrow. Tonight, Babylon was still. Nabu Ramani lay back on a woven mat and rested his head upon his folded arm. Above him stretched the same sky studied by generations of Babylonian observers. Below him lay one of the greatest cities on earth, and somewhere beyond the walls, on roads fading into darkness, travelers were already making their way toward its gates. For a long while, Nabu Ramani did not sleep. The woven mat beneath him was warm from the day, though the night air had begun to cool the rooftop. Somewhere below, his family moved quietly through the last routines before rest. A jar was shifted, a door closed. His sister said something he could not hear, and his mother answered in the patient tone that meant the conversation had ended whether his sister accepted this or not. Then the house grew still. Beyond the parapet, Babylon remained awake in scattered fragments. A lamp moved through a distant street and vanished behind a wall. Another burned steadily in an upper room. Along the Euphrates, small lights marked boats or landings, their reflections trembling whenever the water disturbed them. Nabu Ramani tried to imagine the travelers Belidin had mentioned. Somewhere outside the city, perhaps beneath the same stars, men from the west were approaching with animals, servants, goods, and documents of their own. They might have spent weeks on the road. They would have crossed landscapes very different from the irrigated plain around Babylon. Dry stretches where water determined the rhythm of travel. Settlements clustered around wells or rivers. Cultivated valleys. Dusty tracks followed by generations of merchants. No single road connected the ancient Near East in the manner of a paved highway running neatly between distant cities. Commerce moved through networks. Goods passed from hand to hand. Caravans joined and separated. Merchants relied upon local knowledge, family connections, agents, contracts, and communities established far from home. A piece of fine timber arriving in Babylon might have traveled farther than the person purchasing it ever would. A colored stone in a wealthy household might have begun its journey beyond mountains that most Babylonians knew only by reputation. Tin, essential for making bronze when combined with copper, had traveled extraordinary distances through ancient trade networks long before Nabu Ramani's lifetime. Ideas traveled too. Stories, religious practices, measurements, techniques, words. A city could gather the world without most of its inhabitants leaving their neighborhood. Nabu Ramani closed his eyes. Tomorrow, he thought. Then sleep finally came. For several hours, Babylon disappeared. No ziggurat, no river, no tablets, no merchants, only darkness. Before sunrise, the house began to stir again. His father woke first. Nabu Ramani heard him descend from the roof and resisted opening his eyes. Then came the sound of the courtyard door. Then the familiar movement of pottery. He remained beneath his light covering until a bird began calling from a neighboring roof. It called again, and again. Nabu Ramani opened one eye. The sky was pale gray. He had spent nearly the whole previous day crossing Babylon, settling other men's commercial inconveniences, and now a new day was beginning with the promise of more complicated inconveniences. He sat up. The memory of Bel-Eden's invitation returned. That changed things. Today he would not merely record quantities after an agreement had been made. He would sit near experienced merchants while they negotiated with visitors from distant lands. For someone still young in the scribal profession, observing such a meeting was valuable. One learned commerce partly from tablets. One learned more from watching what happened before anyone agreed to put something on a tablet. Nabu Ramani washed and dressed with greater care than usual. From the wooden chest, he chose a cleaner garment reserved for occasions when appearing competent mattered almost as much as being competent. His father noticed. He said nothing. This was worse than teasing. Nabu Ramani ate bread with dates and drank a little beer, a common part of Mesopotamian diet rather than a luxury reserved for celebration. Ancient Babylonian beer was not necessarily identical to modern varieties, and surviving evidence suggests a range of preparations and qualities. Grain-based drinks provided nourishment as well as refreshment. His mother placed another piece of bread before him. "You will be gone all day?" "Probably." His father answered for him. Negotiations last until everyone becomes too tired to continue disagreeing. Nabu Ramani looked at him. "Is that how you conduct business?" "It is how everyone conducts business. The clever ones simply become tired first." His mother ignored both of them. She wrapped bread and a few dates for Nabu Ramani to carry. By the time he stepped into the lane, dawn had begun properly. Babylon was waking again. Yet the second morning felt different from the first. Yesterday he had barely noticed the people emerging from houses because his mind had been occupied by ordinary work. Today he found himself observing them. Perhaps Bel-Edin's talk of foreign visitors had made his own city seem newly visible. A woman swept dust from her doorway. A man carried a jar toward a neighborhood water source. A baker's fire glowed inside a dark shop. Two apprentices hurried along with a basket between them, arguing quietly over who was carrying more of its weight. Nabu Ramani knew neither boy. Still, he understood the argument perfectly. He entered a wider street. The air carried the smell of morning fires and animals. The sun had not yet risen high enough to heat the walls, and walking was pleasant. Near one crossing, a group of laborers waited beside tools. Some may have been heading toward work connected with construction or canal maintenance. Babylon's monumental architecture demanded enormous quantities of labor and materials, but less celebrated work was equally essential. Canals had to be cleared, banks repaired, streets maintained, walls patched. Mud brick was practical and abundant, but it required care. Rainfall in southern Mesopotamia was limited, yet weather, water, and time all wore at unprotected structures. Buildings were repaired, rebuilt, altered, and sometimes raised upon the remains of earlier buildings. Cities accumulated vertically as well as historically. The Babylon beneath Nabu Ramani's feet rested upon older Babylon, and beneath that lay older layers still. He could not know that future excavators would descend through such layers, trying to reconstruct the city from foundations, broken bricks, tablets, pottery, and traces left in soil. To him, the street was merely a street. He turned northward. Morning traffic increased around him. A flock of sheep blocked a crossing. Nobody appeared surprised. A donkey carrying jars stopped without explanation and refused to continue. Its owner pulled the lead rope. The donkey considered the proposal and rejected it. Nabu Ramani stepped around them. The sun rose. Golden light touched the upper portions of the city first, catching the edges of buildings and then spreading downward. Ahead, the ceremonial quarter began to reveal itself. The blue surfaces near the Ishtar Gate took on color. Even from a distance, they seemed almost impossible against the earth-toned city. The gate, built under Nebuchadnezzar II, formed part of an elaborate monumental landscape. Glazed bricks created a surface of deep blue, while reliefs of bulls and mushushu stood in repeated patterns. The processional way itself carried further decoration, including lions associated with Ishtar. These were not decorations selected merely because they were beautiful. They belonged to a visual language of divine protection, royal devotion, and civic identity. Nabu Ramani passed beneath their gaze. The city gate was already busy. People entered Babylon from the countryside with produce. Others left toward fields, canals, villages, or roads leading farther away. Gateways were places of movement, control, inspection, conversation, and waiting. And waiting was exactly what Nabu Ramani now had to do. Bel-Edin stood near an open area just inside the gate with two assistants and a servant holding water. "You are early," the merchant said. Nabu Ramani felt briefly pleased. Then Bel-Edin added, "So are they late?" The pleasure disappeared. They waited. The sun climbed. More travelers entered, farmers, a small group leading donkeys, a family carrying household bundles, two men whose clothing suggested they came from a region north of Babylon. Still no caravan. Bel-Edin paced. Nabu Ramani found shade. One assistant sat down. The other assistant joined him. Bel-Edin noticed. Both assistants stood again. Time moved gently forward. Then a gate official called to someone outside. Several animals appeared beyond the entrance. Nabu Ramani rose. First came two men on foot, dusty from travel. Behind them walked donkeys carrying carefully secured loads. More men followed. Several wore garments whose cut differed subtly from what Nabu Ramani saw every day in Babylon. One traveler had a beard trimmed in a style unfamiliar to him. Another carried a wooden staff polished smooth by long use. The animals were tired. So were the men. Yet everyone straightened slightly as they passed beneath the immense gate. Visitors did what residents rarely did. They looked up. Nabu-Ramani watched their faces. One man slowed to stare at the glazed creatures upon the walls. Another turned his head toward the processional way. A younger traveler whispered something to his companion. For the first time that morning, Nabu-Ramani saw Babylon through the eyes of strangers. He had passed these walls hundreds of times. He knew where dust collected beside them. He knew which section of the street became crowded in the afternoon. He knew the quickest lane from here to Bel Eden's warehouse, but the travelers saw something else. They saw the capital of an empire. They saw a gate taller and more brilliant than the entrances of most cities they had known. They saw sacred animals advancing across blue walls beneath the morning sun. They saw Babylon. And standing quietly beneath the gateway with a tablet case at his side, Nabu-Ramani suddenly understood how extraordinary his ordinary city appeared from the road. The realization stayed with Nabu-Ramani as the travelers passed fully beneath the gate. For several moments he forgot that he had been waiting for them. The men from the west stood in a loose group beside their animals, blinking beneath the brightness of the Babylonian morning. Dust covered their sandals and clung to the lower edges of their garments. The donkeys lowered their heads whenever permitted, their sides moving slowly after the long approach to the city. Bel Eden, however, had no intention of allowing anyone to admire architecture for long. He stepped forward. Greetings were exchanged. The leader of the visiting merchants introduced himself as Hanno, though the exact form of his name sounded slightly unfamiliar in Nabu-Ramani's ears. He spoke a language of the western lands with his companions, but he also possessed enough Aramaic to conduct business. That was useful. Aramaic had become increasingly important across the Near East, providing a widely understood spoken and written means of communication among people who did not necessarily share the same native tongue. Akkadian, written in cuneiform, still held deep importance in Babylonian administration, scholarship, literature, and legal documentation, while everyday linguistic realities were more complicated than a single language could suggest. Nabu-Ramani lived in that complexity without needing to give it a name. He could hear one language in a market, another from travelers, and still press traditional Akkadian signs into clay when a formal record required it. Hanno glanced at him. Bel Eden explained that Nabu-Ramani would prepare the documents. This produced a brief nod. Nabu-Ramani tried to look like a man who routinely documented transactions involving merchants from distant lands. Inside, he felt very much like a man hoping he had remembered to bring enough writing reeds. The visitors were led away from the gate. Their goods followed. As the little procession entered Babylon, Nabu-Ramani walked beside one of the younger travelers. The man could not have been much older than he was. His hair was dark and dusty, and a narrow leather pouch hung across his chest. For some distance, neither spoke. Then the stranger pointed toward the glazed walls behind them. "Always blue?" His Aramaic was accented but understandable. Nabu-Ramani considered the question. "Yes." The traveler smiled. Nabu-Ramani immediately understood how foolish the answer must have sounded. Of course the gate was always blue, but perhaps what the man really meant was whether Babylon always looked like this, whether every morning began beneath enormous walls, whether divine animals always watched the road, whether residents became accustomed to magnificence. Nabu-Ramani looked back at the gate. "Yes," he repeated more quietly. And that was the strange thing. People could become accustomed to almost anything. The route toward Bel Eden's commercial rooms carried them along streets already crowded with morning activity. The foreigners looked everywhere. At the upper stories of houses, at sellers arranging vegetables, at temple personnel moving through the crowd, at heavily laden donkeys passing within an arm's length. One traveler stopped to watch a barber working beneath an awning until Hanno called him onward. Another stared toward the towering sacred structures visible above the roofs. Nabu Ramani found himself noticing ordinary things because they noticed them. A water seller filling a cup, a child carrying bread, a craftsman sitting cross-legged beside his tools, the smell of bitumen near a repair yard, the dark openings of narrow side streets leading into residential quarters. Babylon was not a city designed to be viewed as a single panorama from the ground. It revealed itself in fragments. A gate here, a temple wall there, a sudden opening toward the river, a glimpse of a palace facade, then another lane enclosed by mud brick, where a chicken wandered past a doorway, as if imperial grandeur were none of its concern. They reached Bel-Idan's rooms before the heat became severe. The visitors' animals were taken to a nearby yard where they could be watered and unloaded. The men themselves entered a shaded courtyard. Jars of water appeared. So did bread and dates. Negotiation did not begin immediately. Travelers had to recover. Hospitality mattered. Names were repeated. Connections were established. Questions were asked about the journey. Hanno reported that one stretch of road had been slower than expected because an animal had gone lame. Another merchant mentioned difficulties finding sufficient water at one stopping place. None of this was written down. Yet Nabu Ramani listened carefully. Business began before the contract. It began in conversation. The goods were eventually brought into the courtyard. One bundle contained dyed textiles. Another held worked objects of wood. There were small quantities of aromatic substances whose scent escaped their containers even before they were opened. Nabu Ramani leaned closer without appearing to do so. The fragrance was unlike anything in his father's storeroom. Resinous, sweet, dry, and almost smoky. A merchant explained its origin through a chain of places that Nabu Ramani only partly recognized. That was often the nature of ancient trade. A seller might know where he had acquired something without knowing where it had first been harvested, mined, cut, or manufactured. Goods could travel through several communities and several merchants before reaching a final buyer. Their histories accumulated invisibly. Nabu Ramani lifted a small piece of dark aromatic resin when invited to inspect it. It weighed almost nothing in his hand, yet it had traveled farther than he ever had. Perhaps farther than he ever would. He returned it carefully. Bel-Idin was interested mainly in the textiles and aromatic materials. Hanno was interested mainly in silver. Thus, the morning's true work began. At first, the discussion was gentle. Bel-Idin praised the quality. Hanno agreed with him. Bel-Idin observed that the journey must have been difficult. Hanno agreed with that too. Bel-Idin then suggested a price. Hanno stopped agreeing. Nabu Ramani sat with fresh clay in front of him and attempted not to react. The visiting merchant gave a counteroffer. Bel-Idin looked genuinely saddened by it. The assistants looked at the floor. Nabu Ramani suspected they had witnessed this performance many times. Quantities were checked. Fibers were examined. Containers were opened. Weights appeared. Nabu Ramani was relieved to see that Bel-Idin had replaced the troublesome warehouse weight from the previous day. Several times he made preliminary notes that were then rendered useless when one side changed a condition. He smoothed the clay and began again. A portion of the payment would be reckoned in silver by weight. Another part of the arrangement involved goods and future obligations. Dates of delivery mattered. So did guarantees. So did the names of men prepared to serve as witnesses. By mid-morning, Nabu Ramani understood why senior scribes were valued. The difficulty was not forming cuneiform signs. The difficulty was capturing exactly what everyone had agreed to after everyone had spent 2 hours avoiding agreement. He listened with intense concentration. A quantity changed. He repeated it aloud. A delivery date changed. He checked it again. A condition concerning damaged goods was added. Bel Eden objected to the wording. Hanno objected to Bel Eden's objection. Fresh clay arrived. The courtyard grew warmer. Bread disappeared. Water jars emptied slowly. Outside, Babylon carried on without them. Through the doorway came pieces of the city's morning. Sandals passing, an animal snorting, a seller calling, wheels creaking somewhere beyond sight. At last, the voices around the table became quieter. This, Nabu Ramani realized, was a good sign. The disagreement had narrowed. Hanno wanted one final adjustment to the amount of silver. Bel Eden resisted. Silence followed. A fly circled the rim of a water cup. One of the foreign merchants stared into the courtyard as though contemplating the meaning of patience. Bel Eden finally named a figure. Hanno considered it. Then he nodded. The change was small. After hours of negotiation, the distance between failure and agreement had become something that would scarcely have paid for the meal they had eaten while arguing. Nabu Ramani lowered his stylus. Agreed? He looked first at Bel Eden, then at Hanno. Both nodded. Now the atmosphere changed entirely. Men who had spent the morning treating one another as dangerous opponents suddenly became reasonable human beings again. Nabu Ramani prepared the final tablet. This time there would be no smoothing away. He recorded the names of the parties, the goods, quantities, silver, obligations, date, and witnesses. Every wedge mattered. The clay received the agreement while it was still soft. Then came the seals. One after another, impressions were made. Hanno possessed a seal carved in a style unfamiliar to Nabu Ramani. He pressed it carefully into the clay. Bel Eden added his own. Witnesses followed. When the tablet was complete, Nabu Ramani held it in both hands. It was small enough to fit comfortably in his palm. Months of travel, animals, foreign roads, workshops, fields, merchants, arguments, silver, promises, all reduced to a piece of damp clay. He looked at it and felt, for the first time, that he understood something his teachers had never explained. A scribe did not merely write about the city. In a quiet way, he helped hold it together. Nabu Ramani was still looking at the tablet when Bel Eden reached for it. "Not yet," Nabu Ramani said. The merchant stopped. For one alarming instant, Nabu Ramani wondered whether a junior scribe was permitted to say those words in that tone. Then he turned the tablet slightly toward the light. The clay was still soft. One witness's seal impression had pressed too close to the final line, leaving the last signs difficult to read. Nothing was actually missing, but the document would pass through other hands. Months from now, perhaps years from now, someone who had not been present in this courtyard might need to understand exactly what had been agreed. Nabu Ramani took the stylus and carefully clarified the damaged wedges. Only then did he hand the tablet over. Bel Eden examined it. Hanno leaned close enough to inspect the seal impressions. Neither objected. The transaction was finished. It should have been an insignificant moment. No trumpets sounded in Babylon. No royal scribe recorded that a young man had successfully completed a merchant's contract on a hot morning. Yet, when Nabu Ramani returned his stylus to its case, he felt taller. The senior scribe who normally served Bel Eden would eventually return. Tomorrow, Nabu Ramani might once again spend half the day recording jars of sesame oil. But today, the clay had been his responsibility. Hanno's companions began preparing to leave the courtyard. They would remain in Babylon for some time, disposing of other goods, arranging purchases for the return journey, visiting contacts and allowing their animals to recover. Hanno himself lingered. He spoke quietly with Bel Idin and then turned toward Nabu Ramani. The younger Western traveler who had asked whether the gate was always blue stood nearby. His name, Nabu Ramani had learned, was Abdi Milk. Hanno said something to him. Abdi Milk translated. Hanno wishes to see the great temple area. Bel Idin nodded. Then, unfortunately, he looked at Nabu Ramani. You know the way. Of course he knew the way. Everyone in Babylon knew the way. Nabu Ramani also knew what Bel Idin's expression meant. The visitors were valuable commercial partners. Sending them wandering alone through unfamiliar streets would be discourteous. And so, a few moments later, Nabu Ramani found himself guiding Hanno, Abdi Milk, and one other merchant toward the center of Babylon. He did not mind. The hardest work of the day was over, and the city beyond the courtyard seemed almost refreshing. Almost. The sun was now high enough to make every patch of shade precious. They walked slowly. The visitors had spent many days traveling and seemed pleased simply to move without animals or cargo. Whenever they reached an intersection, they studied the streets with open curiosity. Abdi Milk asked questions. How far was the river? Could boats pass through the whole city? Was the tower visible from everywhere? How many people lived inside the walls? Nabu Ramani answered the questions he could. The last one defeated him. He had never counted Babylon. Nobody had. Ancient population estimates are uncertain even for modern historians, who must work from the size of settlement, archaeological evidence, written records, food supply, density, and comparison with other cities. Whatever precise number inhabited Babylon during its periods of greatest prosperity, it was unquestionably one of the largest and most important urban centers of its age. Nabu Ramani possessed no such estimate. A great many, he said. Abdi Milk nodded solemnly. This seemed sufficient. They passed a workshop where a metal worker sat near a small furnace. The air around the doorway was unpleasantly hot. Bronze and copper objects required skilled labor, and metal itself had to reach Babylonia through trade because the southern alluvial plain offered no convenient local source of copper ore. Nearby, another craftsman carved a small piece of stone. The visitors slowed. Stone attracted attention precisely because ordinary Babylonian architecture depended so heavily upon clay. Clay was everywhere. It formed bricks, it formed tablets, it formed jars, bowls, lamps, ovens, figurines, and countless other objects. A Babylonian could be born in a mud brick house, eat from pottery, work with clay tablets, worship in temples built largely from brick, and eventually leave behind a life reconstructed thousands of years later through objects made from the same earth beneath his feet. Wood could rot. Textiles could disappear. But fired clay was stubborn. Nabu Ramani did not think about survival through millennia. He was watching a potter's apprentice accidentally distort the rim of a freshly made bowl. The boy stared at the damage. Then he looked toward his master. Then back at the bowl. Nabu Ramani continued walking before discovering how the matter ended. As they approached the sacred district, the streets became increasingly familiar. He had walked here only yesterday with Bel-Idin's message. But beside the visitors, the route seemed changed. Hanno watched the ziggurat appear above the surrounding structures. His pace slowed. Abdi Milk stopped completely. From close by, the enormous mass of Etemenanki overwhelmed the narrower scale of ordinary buildings. For centuries after Babylon ceased to be a great living city, the memory of its tower would become entangled with later traditions and interpretations. The biblical story of the Tower of Babel would make Babylon's name inseparable from the image of humanity building toward heaven, though identifying that literary account simply as a description of Etemenanki would go beyond what the evidence can establish. To the men standing beneath the sun that afternoon, such future associations did not exist. They saw a sacred monument devoted to Marduk. Hanno spoke quietly. Abdi Milk translated. He says men in his city told him Babylon had a mountain made by hands. Nabu Ramani looked upward. Southern Mesopotamia was a land of broad plains. True mountains existed far beyond Babylon, along distant horizons and in lands connected with the city by trade, conquest, stories, and travelers. He had never seen one. "Is it like a mountain?" he asked. Abdi Milk considered the tower. No. Nabu Ramani felt disappointed. Then the traveler smiled. Mountains do not have stairs. They continued toward the Asagila temple complex. Nabu Ramani explained as much as seemed appropriate. Marduk stood at the center of Babylon's civic religious identity. Babylonian theological traditions had elevated him to supreme importance, particularly in texts such as the composition modern scholars call the Enuma Elish, which describes his rise among the gods and his victory over Tiamat within a mythological account of cosmic order. To Nabu Ramani, Marduk was not a literary subject. His presence touched festivals, royal ideology, temple ritual, personal names, prayers, and the way Babylonians understood their city's place in the world. The visitors did not enter every sacred space. Access within temples was regulated, and the most sacred areas were not places where curious foreigners could simply wander. But they could see enough. Courtyards, gateways, temple personnel moving between buildings, supplies being carried, offerings entering, administrative activity continuing in rooms beyond shaded passages. Hanno appeared surprised by the bustle. Perhaps he had expected solemn silence. Nabu Ramani understood. Foreigners saw the towering monuments and imagined that the sacred district existed apart from ordinary life. But temples had kitchens, storehouses, land, workers, records, animals, workshops. Temple institutions received and distributed substantial quantities of goods and supported complex communities of personnel. The sacred and practical occupied the same courtyards. A porter carrying a basket nearly collided with Abdi Milk. The visitor stepped aside just in time. The porter continued without apology. Abdi Milk watched him disappear. Then he looked at Nabu Ramani. Even beside the gods, people are in a hurry. Nabu Ramani laughed. It was a quiet laugh, quickly lost beneath the enormous walls. They moved back toward the processional way. The afternoon light had begun to mellow, though several hours remained before sunset. A breeze wandered through the open space and stirred the edges of garments. For a while, none of them spoke. Then Hanno indicated the road beneath their feet and asked something. Abdi Milk translated. "Where does it lead during the great festival?" Nabu Ramani knew immediately which festival he meant. The Akitu, the Babylonian New Year festival. He remembered again his father lifting him above the crowd when he was a child. The blue walls, the lions, the press of bodies, and the feeling that all Babylon had gathered into one long river of people. He began explaining the route. And as he spoke, a distant sound of music drifted unexpectedly along the street, so faint that for a moment he wondered whether memory itself had made it. The music came again. This time, Abdi Milk heard it too. He turned his head toward the sound. It was not the full music of the Akitu festival, nor anything grand enough to fill the processional way. Only a few instruments were being played somewhere beyond the nearby buildings, perhaps in preparation for a private ceremony, a temple duty, or an evening gathering. A drum gave a slow pulse. Above it floated the thin voice of a reed instrument. Then the wind shifted, and the melody faded. For Nabu Ramani, however, memory had already opened. He stood beneath the afternoon light and saw the processional way as it had appeared when he was a child. Not exactly as it had been, perhaps. Memory rearranged things. The crowd seemed larger every time he remembered it. The walls seemed higher, the blue brighter. During the Akitu festival, Babylon entered one of the most important periods of its religious calendar. The ceremonies extended across many days and involved Marduk, the king, temple personnel, divine images, processions, prayers, and rituals tied to ideas of renewal and proper cosmic order. Some details are preserved imperfectly, and practices changed across Babylon's long history. But the festival was no quiet household observance. The city itself became part of the ceremony. Nabu Ramani explained this slowly to the visitors. He showed them the direction in which the sacred procession traveled. Hanno listened while Abdi Milk translated. At certain moments, divine statues could be carried in procession, their movement understood within the religious beliefs of the people not as merely transporting carved objects, but as participation by the gods represented through their cult images. Crowds gathered. Priests performed prescribed duties. Music accompanied movement. Offerings were made. The king himself had a role. Nabu Ramani remembered very little of the king from childhood. He remembered waiting. He remembered being thirsty. He remembered a man behind his father complaining that someone in front was too tall. He remembered the lions, especially the lions. Along portions of the processional way, glazed brick reliefs showed lions striding in repeated rows, their bodies powerful, their mouths open, their colors standing boldly against the blue ground. They belonged to Ishtar. As a boy, Nabu Ramani had been convinced that when nobody watched, the lions continued walking. He did not mention this. Abdi Milk was looking at the decorations now. "Do you attend every year?" "When I can." "And the whole city comes?" Nabu Ramani smiled. "It feels that way." They continued northward at an easy pace. The afternoon had turned gentle enough that people were returning to the streets in greater numbers. Doorways that had remained dark during the hottest hours opened again. Servants carried baskets. Craftsmen resumed work beneath shaded fronts. Somewhere a woman was grinding grain. The rhythmic, stone-on-stone sound escaped a courtyard and followed them briefly. Hanno stopped near a cellar of small baked cakes. He purchased several after a negotiation considerably shorter than the morning's commercial meeting. One was handed to Nabu Ramani. It contained dates. He accepted it. The exterior was slightly crisp, the interior dense and sweet. Abdi Milk bit into his and immediately nodded with grave approval. For several minutes, the international complexities of Babylonian trade were forgotten. They were simply four men eating. They reached a point where the Euphrates could be seen between buildings. Hanno wanted to go closer. Nabu Ramani led them down toward the quay. The river had changed since morning. Its surface now reflected the softer light of late afternoon, broken by boats moving through long ribbons of gold and brown. The western merchants stood still. Perhaps they had crossed the Euphrates elsewhere during their journey. Perhaps they knew other rivers better. But here the water belonged visibly to the city. Buildings approached its banks. Landings crowded the shore. Boats tied Babylon to countryside and distant settlements. A vessel passed carrying baskets covered with matting. Another sat low in the water beneath a heavy load. Boatmen used poles, paddles, towing, and currents according to the craft and circumstances. Mesopotamian waterways functioned as essential transportation routes through a landscape where canals linked farms, towns, and larger river systems. Abdi Milk crouched near the edge. He touched the water with his fingertips. "It looks slower than our rivers." Nabu Ramani had no idea which rivers he meant. "This one has moods." Abdi Milk looked up. All rivers have moods. On this they discovered east and west could agree. They followed the quay. Nabu Ramani pointed toward warehouses and explained how goods arriving from agricultural lands might be stored, measured, redistributed, or sent elsewhere. Hanno asked several practical questions. How expensive was storage? Which goods spoiled fastest? Were river tolls collected? Who controlled particular landings? Nabu Ramani could answer only some of them. He began to suspect that Hanno's desire to see Babylon was not entirely that of an admiring traveler. A merchant remained a merchant even while sightseeing. Every warehouse was a possibility. Every key was information. Every road might someday carry his goods. Bel Eden would probably have approved. The group eventually reached a quieter section near the river where date palms rose above a wall. Their green crowns moved gently against the sky. Abdi Milk stared. Nabu Ramani had almost forgotten that even plants could interest visitors. Beyond Babylon's crowded streets lay an irrigated landscape where date palms were among the most characteristic trees. Their fruit was valuable, but their importance went beyond sweetness. Different parts of the palm could serve practical uses, and groves created shade in a country where shade itself had value. The Westerners spoke among themselves. Nabu Ramani caught none of it. Hanno then asked whether Babylon possessed gardens as magnificent as those described by travelers. Nabu Ramani hesitated. Stories of extraordinary royal gardens circulated in antiquity, and later, Greek and Roman writers would make the Hanging Gardens of Babylon one of the most celebrated wonders associated with the city. Yet modern historians continue to debate the evidence. No surviving Babylonian text securely identifies Nebuchadnezzar's famous Hanging Gardens in the form later tradition describes, and some scholars have proposed that traditions about magnificent elevated gardens may instead relate to the Assyrian city of Nineveh. Nabu Ramani, living inside our imagined day, could not settle a question that would trouble scholars millennia later. He knew royal gardens existed. Kings valued planted spaces. Palaces could contain carefully maintained vegetation, shaded courts, unusual trees, and watered grounds that required substantial labor in the dry Mesopotamian environment. But the marvelous terraced mountain of greenery described in later stories? He had never seen such a thing. "There are gardens near the palace," he said. Hanno waited. Nabu Ramani realized the visitor expected more. Very fine gardens. Still, Hanno waited. "With trees," Abdi Milk translated. Hanno said something. Abdi Milk laughed. "He says travelers in the West make them sound large enough for a man to become lost for 3 days. Nabu Ramani looked toward the palms. "Travelers become lost easily." Abdi Milk laughed again. The sun was descending now. Its light struck the river almost horizontally. The air cooled with surprising speed, and the smell of water became stronger as the heat withdrew from the quay. Nabu Ramani suddenly remembered his family. He had promised nobody that he would return early, but his mother would have expected him before dark. He told the merchants that they should go back. Hanno agreed. They retraced their route toward Bel Eden's quarter. Babylon was entering its evening transformation. Cooking fires appeared. Smoke drifted upward. Bread sellers became busy. People returning from work met others emerging for errands. A man carrying reeds brushed past them. 2 women stopped in a doorway to exchange news. A group of children had invented a game involving pebbles and a line scratched into the ground. None looked toward the great monuments. Above them, the monumental city remained magnificent. Below, the ordinary city was hungry. At Belidin's courtyard, Hanno thanked Nabu Ramani formally. Abdi Milk was less formal. He held out his hand in farewell, then said, "Tomorrow, you show me the market where ordinary people buy things." Nabu Ramani stared at him. They had spent much of the day walking through markets where ordinary people bought things. Abdi Milk seemed to understand his confusion. "No merchants." He pointed toward Hanno. "No contracts. then toward himself. Only food. Nabu Ramani finally understood. He agreed. When he stepped back into the street alone, twilight was spreading through Babylon. For the first time since morning, nobody required anything from him. He walked home slowly. The city felt different again. Yesterday he had seen it as a resident. This morning he had seen it through the eyes of travelers. Now, as lamps appeared behind doorways and the first evening star emerged above the roofs, he felt both views existing at once. Babylon was astonishing. Babylon was ordinary. Perhaps every great city was both. He turned into his family's lane. His sister was waiting near the doorway. The new hairpin was still in her hair. She saw him and ran inside. "Nabu Ramani is back." From the courtyard came his father's voice. "Ask him whether foreigners have finally bought all of Babylon." Nabu Ramani entered smiling. And behind him, beyond the closing door, the greatest city of his world settled gently into another night. Inside the courtyard, the evening meal was already waiting. Nabu Ramani washed the dust from his hands while his sister followed him from one side of the courtyard to the other, asking questions about the foreigners. Were their clothes strange? Did they speak Babylonian? Had they brought gold? Did they have lions in their country? Nabu Ramani answered the first three questions and admitted ignorance about the fourth. His father sat near the wall with a cup in his hand. "They did not buy Babylon, then?" "Not today." "Good. Your mother has just swept the courtyard." Nabu Ramani sat beside him. His mother brought bread, onions, a little cheese, and a bowl of vegetables cooked until soft. The family ate beneath a sky that had deepened from blue to violet. Nabu Ramani described the negotiations. This time his father listened with greater attention than usual. When Nabu Ramani explained that he had prepared the final tablet himself, the older man stopped eating. "The final one?" "Yes." "With witnesses?" "Yes." "And seals?" "Yes." His father nodded once. That was all. Yet Nabu Ramani knew him well enough to understand the meaning of that nod. Praise in their household was rarely extravagant. His mother was less restrained. "That is good." His sister looked impressed for perhaps 3 breaths. Then she asked whether the foreigners had brought gold again. After the meal, Nabu Ramani climbed to the roof. The city around him had become an arrangement of shadows and lamps. Somewhere beyond the neighborhood, the Euphrates reflected a narrow path of moonlight. He thought of Abdi Milk's request. Only food. It amused him. Foreign merchants had traveled for days to reach Babylon, and tomorrow one of them wished to see onions. Yet perhaps that was not so strange. Nabu Ramani himself had spent the day seeing ordinary Babylon differently, because strangers were beside him. He lay down. The roof still held a little warmth. Before sleep came, he wondered what he would show Abdi Milk. Bread, certainly. Dates. Fish. Perhaps the stalls where garlic and onions were piled in baskets. Beer, if they found a respectable place. Cheese, if the morning supply was good. He smiled into the darkness, a tour of Babylon no royal inscription would ever describe. At dawn, he woke before anyone called him. The air smelled faintly of smoke from a neighboring hearth. His mother was grinding something in the courtyard below. For once, Nabu Ramani had no urgent tablet waiting for him. Bel Idan had given him the morning free after the previous day's work, though he was expected later at the warehouse. He ate quickly and left while the streets were still cool. Abdi Milk was waiting near Bel Idan's rooms. Without Hanno beside him, he looked younger. He had exchanged his travel-stained outer garment for a cleaner one, though his sandals still carried dust from the road. "No contracts," he said immediately. "No contracts," Nabu Ramani agreed. They began walking. Instead of leading him toward the monumental streets, Nabu Ramani turned into a network of smaller lanes. Abdi Milk noticed. "This way?" "You asked for ordinary food." The first market was already busy. It occupied no grand square. Stalls, doorways, baskets, and temporary awnings gathered along a wider street where customers could move between sellers. The smells arrived before the goods became visible. Fresh bread, warm grain, fish, dates, oil, garlic, sweat, dust, smoke. A vendor lifted flat pieces of bread from a hot surface. Nabu Ramani bought two. The bread was still warm enough that Abdi Milk shifted it from one hand to the other. He tore off a piece. His expression changed immediately. Better than road bread. That is not difficult. For travelers, durable food mattered more than elegance. Bread carried for days hardened. Grain might be transported and prepared during a journey. Dates were especially convenient, providing concentrated sweetness and energy without requiring elaborate preparation. Babylon's morning bread needed no such endurance. They ate while walking. At the next stall, baskets held dates in several qualities. Some were soft and dark, others were firmer. The seller recognized Nabu Ramani and named a price that suggested either great affection or great optimism. Nabu Ramani objected. Abdi Milk watched the exchange. You said no contracts. This is not a contract. It sounds like yesterday. This is different. How? Nabu Ramani considered. It is about dates. Apparently, this explanation satisfied him. They bought a small handful. Abdi Milk tried one, then another. He pointed toward the basket. Those travel well? Nabu Ramani stared at him. The merchant had returned. Even without Hanno, trade entered every conversation. Yes? Abdi Milk asked the price of a larger quantity. Nabu Ramani laughed. No contracts. The visitor accepted his defeat and ate another date. They continued deeper into the market. A fish seller had arranged the morning catch on wet reeds. The Euphrates and the waterways of southern Mesopotamia supplied fish that formed an important part of local diets. Some fish could be eaten fresh, while preservation through drying or salting made transport and storage possible. Abdi Milk examined one large fish with suspicion. It was swimming this morning, the seller told him through Nabu Ramani. Abdi Milk looked at the fish, then at the seller. He said something in his own language. What did he say? The seller asked. Nabu Ramani had no idea. He admires it. The seller seemed pleased. They moved on before further translation became necessary. Near a shaded doorway, a woman sold bowls of thick grain porridge topped with onions and herbs. Workers stood nearby eating quickly before beginning their day. Nabu Ramani bought 2 portions. They sat on low stools beside the wall. The porridge was plain, warm, and filling. Abdi Milk ate several spoonfuls in silence. This is what ordinary people eat? Some ordinary people. Every morning. Some mornings. The visitor frowned. Nabu Ramani realized that he wanted simple answers about a city that resisted them. Babylon contained wealthy households where meals could include considerable variety. It contained laborers living on much narrower diets. Temple dependents might receive rations. Farmers consumed what household production, markets, obligations, and seasons allowed. Children ate differently from adults. Festival food differed from daily food. The sick, the poor, merchants, priests, slaves, craftsmen, and officials did not all sit before identical bowls. There was no single Babylonian breakfast. Nabu Ramani tried to explain this. Abdi Milk listened. Then he scraped the last porridge from his bowl. This one is good. That, at least, was simple. A brewer's establishment opened nearby as the morning advanced. Beer occupied an important place in Mesopotamian life. It appeared in rations and offerings and was consumed across social settings, though its strength, ingredients, texture, and preparation varied. Modern attempts to imagine all Babylonian beer as one thick drink consumed through long straws simplify a much more complicated history. Nabu Ramani and Abdi Milk shared a modest cup. The visitor tasted it carefully. He nodded. Then he tasted it again with greater confidence. "You have this in the West? We have better." Nabu Ramani looked offended. Abdi Milk grinned. Some cultural disagreements could not be solved by scribes. Outside, the market had become crowded. Women selected vegetables. Servants carried baskets back toward wealthy households. A man inspected onions one by one with extraordinary seriousness. A child begged for something sweet. 2 dogs waited near the fish cellar with the patient faith of creatures who believed every human mistake ultimately benefited dogs. The sunlight strengthened. Abdi Milk stood in the middle of it all and slowly turned around. No blue gate towered above him. No ziggurat filled the sky. No royal procession passed. There was only food being bought for dinner. Perhaps that was precisely what he had wanted. "My city has mornings like this," he said. Nabu Ramani looked around. "Then why travel so far?" Abdi Milk smiled. "Because the dates are different." They walked on. At a narrow stall near the end of the market, an elderly man sold spices and aromatic plants in small containers. Abdi Milk stopped. He leaned close. Then he pointed. The old seller looked up. A conversation began in fragments of Aramaic, gestures and words Nabu Ramani did not recognize. The visitor suddenly laughed. He reached into his pouch and produced a tiny packet. The old man smelled its contents. His face brightened. He disappeared behind his stall and returned with another substance. For several minutes the 2 men compared scents, origins, prices, and names. Nabu Ramani stood beside them, understanding almost nothing. And then he understood something else. Yesterday he had shown a foreign merchant Babylon's monuments. Today, Babylon's market was showing him its connections. The old seller had never met Abdi Milk. They did not share a native language. They had been born far apart. Yet they recognized the same resin by scent. A little piece of the world had traveled between them before either man knew the other existed. Above the market, morning light touched the roofs. Beyond them rose the temples and walls of Babylon. But here, among bowls, fish, onions, dates, bread, and fragrant dust, the city's greatness seemed to Nabu Ramani less like the achievement of kings. It seemed instead like thousands of paths crossing in one place. The old seller held the packet of resin beneath his nose once more, then carefully folded it closed. Abdi Milk watched with the satisfaction of a man who had discovered a familiar face in an unfamiliar crowd. They exchanged a few more words. Nabu Ramani caught the names of 2 coastal places, one of which he recognized from commercial texts, though he had never imagined it as anything more than wedges pressed into clay. That realization pleased him. A place could exist first as writing. Then, unexpectedly, a man standing beside you could have walked its streets. Abdi Milk returned the packet to his pouch. The seller offered him a pinch of another aromatic substance in exchange. No silver was weighed. No witness was called. No tablet was needed. The 2 merchants simply nodded to one another. "No contracts," Nabu Ramani said. Abdi Milk smiled. "No contracts." They left the stall. By now the market had reached its fullest morning activity. Sunlight struck the open sections of the street, while everyone who could do so remained beneath awnings and strips of shade. Flies gathered around fruit and fish. Sellers brushed them away without interrupting conversation. The smell of bread followed Nabu Ramani wherever he went. So did the smell of onions. Perhaps, he thought, Abdi Milk would return west and describe Babylon as a city constructed entirely from blue bricks, dates, and onions. They reached a crossing where a water carrier was filling vessels. Nearby, several people waited with jars. The sight was ordinary enough that Nabu Ramani would usually have passed without noticing, but Abdi Milk stopped. He watched a woman balance a filled jar for the journey home. Water shaped domestic life as surely as it shaped fields. A household needed it for drinking, cooking, washing, brewing, and countless small tasks. Access varied according to location and circumstance. Wells, canals, river water, stored water, and carriers all formed parts of the practical landscape of Mesopotamian cities. The great Euphrates might dominate maps of Babylon. Inside a house, what mattered was the jar. Nabu Ramani suddenly remembered his mother asking the previous evening whether one of their vessels had begun leaking. He had promised to look at it. He had forgotten. History, he decided, was easier than remembering household errands. Abdi Milk had wandered toward a pottery cellar. Rows of vessels stood beneath an awning. Large storage jars, cooking pots, bowls, small cups, lamps. Some were plain and practical. Others bore careful finishing or decoration. Abdi Milk picked up a small bowl. He turned it over. "You need one?" "No." "Then put it down." The seller, hearing Nabu Ramani's tone, if not necessarily every word, laughed. Abdi Milk returned the bowl. A little farther on, they found the damaged jar Nabu Ramani had forgotten. Not literally the same vessel, of course, but a replacement of suitable size. He bought it. Abdi Milk looked delighted. "You brought me to see ordinary Babylon and bought a pot." "My mother needs a pot. This is very ordinary." "It is becoming expensive." The jar was awkward to carry. Nabu Ramani shifted it under one arm. They continued. The market gradually thinned behind them as they entered a residential district. Here, the city became quieter again. High mud brick walls protected courtyards from the street. Doors stood open where families carried out morning work. Somewhere, grain was being ground. Somewhere else, wool was being spun. Through one doorway came the repetitive clack of a loom. Abdi Milk slowed. Textile production was not confined to large workshops. Spinning and weaving could take place within households as well as institutional and commercial environments, and the labor behind cloth was so constant that people living among it rarely considered how much time a finished garment represented. A woman sat in the shade working with thread. Beside her, a girl attempted the same task with less success. The girl's fingers stopped when she noticed the foreigner looking through the doorway. Abdi Milk immediately looked away. Nabu Ramani approved. Babylon could be crowded, but privacy still mattered. They walked on. The lanes twisted enough that Abdi Milk soon admitted he had no idea where they were. "I thought Babylon had great straight roads." "It does." "This is not one." "No." "Why?" "Because my mother does not live on the processional way." Abdi Milk accepted this. The contrast between Babylon's monumental avenues and its smaller residential streets was one of the city's quiet realities. Royal building could impose order on ceremonial space, but neighborhoods grew through generations of houses, property boundaries, rebuilding, subdivision, inheritance, and everyday use. A great city was never entirely designed. Much of it simply accumulated. The jar grew heavier. Nabu Ramani regretted buying it so early. They stopped beneath the shade of an upper wall. Abdi Milk leaned against the brick. "Your city is larger than I expected." Nabu Ramani set down the jar. "How large did you expect?" Abdi Milk spread his hands. Large. That is useful. I had heard stories. What stories? The visitor considered. Walls no army could cross. A tower that touched the sky. Palaces filled with gold. Gardens hanging over the city. Streets where every nation of the earth comes to trade. Nabu Ramani looked around. A chicken scratched in the dust. A little boy was trying to retrieve a reed ball from beneath a bench. Somebody inside the nearest house was arguing about flour. This street disappoints you? Abdi Milk shook his head. No. He watched the boy finally reach the ball. It makes the stories better. Nabu Ramani did not understand. Abdi Milk searched for the words. If everything were palaces, who would bake the bread? That remained with Nabu Remini. They resumed walking. Soon the rooftops opened enough for Etemenanki to appear in the distance. Even here, surrounded by domestic walls, the great ziggurat seemed to hover above ordinary life. A woman emerged carrying a basket of laundry. Behind her rose the sacred tower. The combination struck Nabu Ramani as oddly perfect. Babylon did not choose between the immense and the small. It contained both at once. They reached his family's lane shortly before midday. Nabu Ramani had intended only to leave the pottery jar at home before taking Abdi Milk back toward Bel Eden's quarter, but his sister was standing in the doorway. She saw him. Then she saw the foreigner. Her eyes widened. Nabu Ramani knew immediately that escape was impossible. His mother appeared behind her. She looked at the jar first, then at Abdi Milk, then back at Nabu Ramani. There was a short silence. Nabu Ramani introduced his companion. Abdi Milk offered a respectful greeting in careful Aramaic. His mother's expression softened. You have eaten? Nabu Ramani closed his eyes briefly. Every culture had questions that were not really questions. Abdi Milk looked toward him for help. Nabu Ramani translated the intention rather than the words. You are staying for the midday meal. Abdi Milk hesitated. From somewhere inside the house came the smell of lentils, herbs, and bread. His hesitation ended. And so, the Western merchant who had entered Babylon beneath the blue Ishtar gate, who had admired the towering temples and bargained over fragrant goods from distant lands, stepped through the modest doorway of Nabu Ramani's family home. The great city disappeared behind him. Inside waited a shaded courtyard, a leaking jar about to be replaced, bread cooling beside the hearth, and a family suddenly very curious about the world beyond Babylon's walls. Abdi Milk entered the courtyard with the careful politeness of a man crossing a border more delicate than any city gate. Nabu Ramani set the new pottery jar beside the wall. His mother inspected it immediately. She tapped the side with one finger, examined the rim, then looked at her son. How much? Nabu Ramani told her. She looked at the jar again, then at him. Abdi Milk, understanding neither the words nor the danger, stood quietly nearby. Nabu Ramani's mother finally nodded. The jar had survived judgment. His sister was less interested in pottery. She stared openly at their guest until Nabu Ramani gave her a warning look. She lowered her eyes. A moment later, she was staring again. Abdi Milk noticed and smiled. He removed the small packet of aromatic resin from his pouch and held it toward her. She looked at Nabu Ramani before accepting it. Smell it. She did. Her expression changed. The fragrance was warm and unfamiliar, carrying something of dry hills and distant trees into the shaded Babylonian courtyard. Nabu Ramani's mother smelled it next. Even his father, who had appeared from an inner room with the cautious expression of a man discovering that his midday meal now included an unexpected foreign merchant, leaned closer. For a few moments, conversation became unnecessary. A scent had crossed languages more easily than words. Abdi Milk explained that the resin had come through traders from lands nearer the Western Sea. Nabu Ramani translated. His father asked which sea. Abdi Milk answered. Nabu Ramani knew its name from geographical traditions and merchants' accounts, but the idea of an enormous body of water beyond the western lands remained difficult to imagine. The Euphrates was large enough. A sea seemed excessive. They sat around the meal. Bread was broken and passed. There were lentils cooked with onions and herbs, a small dish of cheese, cucumbers, dates, and a little leftover fish. Abdi Milk accepted everything offered to him. Nabu Ramani suspected that his mother considered this evidence of excellent character. His father began with practical questions. How long had the journey taken? Which route had they used? Were the roads safe? Where had they bought their animals? How expensive was barley farther west? Abdi Milk answered patiently through Nabu Ramani's translation. Soon the questions traveled farther than commerce. What did houses look like in his city? Did people sleep on roofs during hot weather? What crops grew nearby? Was winter colder? Did they eat dates? Did they really have better beer? At this, Nabu Ramani's father looked at his son. You told him ours was better? He said theirs was. His father turned toward Abdi Milk. No, Nabu Ramani translated. Abdi Milk laughed. The disagreement spread through the household with surprising speed. His mother remained loyal to Babylon. His sister had never tasted Western beer, but announced that it was obviously inferior. Abdi Milk defended his homeland with dignity. Nobody possessed enough comparative evidence to settle the matter. The conversation moved on. He described a coastal harbor filled with ships. Nabu Ramani tried to imagine it. Babylon knew boats intimately, but seagoing vessels belonged to another scale of distance. Abdi Milk spoke of salt carried on the air, of waves striking stone, of gulls circling above waterfronts, and of ships disappearing beyond the line where water met sky. Nabu Ramani's sister stopped eating. You cannot see the other side. Abdi Milk shook his head. She looked deeply suspicious. Every landscape taught its inhabitants what seemed normal. For Nabu Ramani, water belonged inside banks. It ran along rivers and canals. It could flood, change course, rise dangerously, or shrink with season and circumstance, but it was supposed to have land on either side. The idea of water continuing beyond sight seemed almost as strange to him as Etemenanki had seemed to Abdi Milk. His father asked whether ships on the sea followed canals. Abdi Milk laughed until he realized the question was serious. No. Then how do they know where to go? The coast, stars, winds, experience. At the word stars, Nabu Ramani became interested. Babylonian scholars had watched the heavens for generations, yet here was another form of knowledge shaped by travel. Sailors watched stars not primarily for omens or scholarly records, but because darkness above an open sea could become a guide. Different people could look at the same point of light and ask different questions of it. A scholar might record its rising. A priest might consider its significance. A sailor might use it to find home. Nabu Ramani thought of the thin crescent moon they had watched from the roof. The sky belonged to everyone, but nobody saw exactly the same sky. After the meal, the household slowed beneath the noon heat. His father withdrew to rest. His mother and sister cleared the dishes. Abdimilk offered to help. This produced enough surprise that he was immediately given a bowl to carry. Nabu Ramani leaned against the courtyard wall and watched the foreign merchant place the bowls beside the hearth under his mother's direction. "You crossed half the world for this," he said. Abdimilk looked at the bowl in his hands. "This?" "To carry dishes in my mother's courtyard." Abdimilk set it down. "I have carried worse things farther." The heat outside had become severe, so neither man hurried to leave. They sat in the shade. For a while, conversation drifted into silence. A fly moved near the date bowl. Somewhere overhead, a pigeon cooed. The walls held back the brightness of the street, creating a pocket of shadow where the afternoon seemed suspended. Abdimilk eventually looked around. "Your house is quiet." Nabu Ramani listened. From the neighboring courtyard came someone grinding grain. A child cried farther away. An animal shuffled in the lane. "You call this quiet?" "Compared with Belidin." Nabu Ramani smiled. That was fair. Abdimilk traced a line in the dusty floor with one finger. "Do you ever leave Babylon?" The question surprised him. Nabu Ramani thought of journeys to nearby settlements with his father when he was younger. He had traveled along canals and through agricultural lands outside the walls. Once he had accompanied a shipment for several days. But compared with Abdimilk's roads, these excursions seemed very small. "Not far. You want to?" Nabu Ramani looked upward. The courtyard framed a rectangle of brilliant sky. Beyond the walls lay roads toward cities he knew from tablets: Uruk, Sippar, Borsippa, cities farther north, lands beyond the Euphrates, mountains he had never seen, the Western Sea. He had always imagined such places as names attached to goods. Cedar came from somewhere. Metals came from somewhere. Resins came from somewhere. Foreign merchants came from somewhere. He had rarely wondered what it would feel like to stand in that somewhere. "Perhaps," he said. Abdimilk nodded. "There are worse cities than Babylon." "Your praise is overwhelming. There are also better cities." Nabu Ramani looked at him. Abdimilk smiled. "A man must say that about his home." That answer Nabu Ramani understood. By early afternoon, the light in the courtyard had shifted enough to tell them the worst heat would soon begin passing. Nabu Ramani needed to report to Belidin's warehouse. Abdimilk rose. Before leaving, he thanked the family. His mother wrapped 2 pieces of bread for him. He protested. She ignored him. Nabu Ramani translated nothing. Some matters required no translation. They stepped back into the lane. For several breaths, after the cool courtyard, the outside world seemed painfully bright. Abdimilk adjusted his eyes. Then he looked back at the modest doorway. "The stories never mention houses like yours." "No. They should." Nabu Ramani picked up his tablet case. Above the roofs, Etemenanki stood in the distance, enormous and sacred beneath the white-blue sky. Behind them, his mother was already transferring water into the new jar. Ahead waited warehouses, merchants, river traffic, and another afternoon of ordinary Babylonian work. Nabu Ramani began walking, and for once the foreign visitor beside him did not look toward the tower. He looked instead at the doorways they passed. The doorways led them back toward the river. At first, Nabu Ramani and Abdimilk walked without speaking. The afternoon still pressed warmly against the city, but shadows had begun to lengthen from the western sides of walls. A little breeze found its way through the narrower streets, carrying dust, cooking smoke, and the cooler scent of water from somewhere ahead. Behind one doorway, a baby was being soothed. Behind another came the scraping sound of grain being ground. A man sat outside repairing a sandal, drawing a leather thong carefully through a worn section of the sole. He glanced up as they passed, and then returned immediately to his work. Abdi Milk noticed him. Yesterday, he might have stopped to stare at the ziggurat. Today, he watched a cobbler. Nabu Ramani found this quietly amusing. They emerged into a busier street where a donkey train had temporarily blocked nearly everyone. The first animal had stopped. The animals behind it had therefore stopped. A porter tried to squeeze around them with a basket balanced against his shoulder. Two children slipped through a gap that no adult could have used. A woman carrying bread waited beneath an awning with the patient expression of someone who knew that arguing with donkeys rarely improved a journey. The owner pulled the lead rope. The donkey did nothing. Abdi Milk watched. Is this also one of Babylon's wonders? The oldest one. The animal eventually reconsidered its position, and the street began moving again. They reached the commercial quarter shortly afterward. Bel Idin was in the warehouse. So was Hanno. Both men were standing over an opened container of aromatic material, with expressions suggesting that the morning's peaceful agreement had belonged to a happier age. Abdi Milk looked at Nabu Ramani. "No contracts," he whispered. Nabu Ramani almost laughed. Belidin saw them. "You're late." Nabu Ramani glanced at the sunlight. "I was told to come in the afternoon." "It is the afternoon." There was no useful reply to this. He sat near the records and took out his stylus. The problem, fortunately, proved less serious than it first appeared. A portion of the imported aromatics was to be divided among several buyers, and one customer had requested a different quantity from that originally expected. Nothing in the previous contract needed alteration. Bel Idin merely wanted the new distribution recorded correctly. Nabu Ramani prepared several small tablets. Names, amounts, recipients, dates. The work was repetitive, but pleasant after the complicated negotiations of the previous day. Abdi Milk sat nearby eating the bread Nabu Ramani's mother had given him. Hanno noticed. He asked where it came from. Abdi Milk answered. Hanno looked at Nabu Ramani. Then he looked at the bread. A moment later, Abdi Milk tore off a piece and handed it to him. Thus, Nabu Ramani's mother, without leaving her courtyard, provided part of the afternoon meal of two foreign merchants. The thought pleased him. The Western Sea no longer seemed quite so impossibly distant. By the time the final tablet was complete, shadows had reached across much of the courtyard. Belidin checked the records. For once he found nothing to complain about. Good. The word was casual. Nabu Ramani felt more satisfaction from it than he wished to admit. Hanno and his companions would remain in Babylon for several more days, but the main transaction between the two merchants was finished. Goods would be collected. Other purchases would be made. Animals would rest before the long return journey. Abdi Milk would go with them. Nabu Ramani had known that from the beginning. Still, hearing Hanno mention their expected departure made something inside the afternoon shift. Perhaps it was because Abdi Milk had so quickly become part of his daily routes. 2 mornings ago, he had been merely a foreign traveler beneath the blue gate. Now he had eaten in Nabu Ramani's courtyard. His mother had fed him. His sister had asked him impossible questions about the sea. He had insulted Babylonian beer. People became familiar with alarming speed. Nabu Ramani carried the finished tablets into the storage room. Rows of older documents rested in baskets and containers. Some had been prepared before he was born. Others had been written by men now dead. Clay held voices without sound. He placed the new tablets among them. One day, he supposed, someone might open this basket and read his signs without knowing anything about the afternoon on which he had made them. The reader would know that a certain quantity of aromatic material had been assigned to a certain buyer. He would not know that Abdi Milk had been eating bread nearby. He would not know about the stubborn donkey in the street. He would not know that Nabu Ramani had begun imagining the Western Sea. Records preserved facts. Life happened around them. He stepped outside again. Bel Idin had left to meet another merchant. Hanno was speaking with one of his companions. Abdi Milk waited near the entrance. Finished? For today. Then come. Where? Abdi Milk pointed toward the river. You showed me your food. Nabu Ramani followed him out. You have no ship hidden there, I hope? No. Good. The Euphrates was glowing when they reached it. Late sunlight spread across the water, and every passing boat broke the reflection into trembling pieces. They found a place above the quay where they could sit on a low wall without obstructing workers. For a while, they watched the river. A small boat approached the landing. A larger vessel moved downstream. On the opposite bank, figures walked through the golden haze of evening. Abdi Milk took the packet of resin from his pouch. He placed it beside him. At home, he said. The air smells of salt when the wind comes from the sea. Nabu Ramani tried to imagine salt carried invisibly through the air. Does everything taste of it? No. Then what is the purpose? Abdi Milk considered. There is no purpose. This answer puzzled Nabu Ramani. Much of his world had a purpose. A canal carried water. A seal identified its owner. A tablet preserved an agreement. A wall protected a house. Even a date stone could become fuel or find some other use. The idea that the sea might simply send its scent across a city for no practical reason seemed strangely luxurious. Abdi Milk pointed toward the Euphrates. What does your river smell like? Nabu Ramani almost answered that it smelled like water. Instead, he breathed carefully. Mud, reeds, fish, bitumen from the quays, wet rope, the faint sweetness of nearby dates, smoke from evening fires. Perhaps the river itself could not be separated from everything happening beside it. Babylon, he said. Abdi Milk nodded as though this made perfect sense. The sun touched the horizon. The walls beyond the river turned amber. Birds moved in small groups overhead, returning toward places Nabu Ramani could not see. He thought again of the city as Abdi Milk must have seen it upon arrival. The immense gate, the blue bricks, the sacred animals. Etemenanki rising above roofs, the palace quarter, the river. All the things kings wished visitors to remember. Yet now Abdi Milk had seen something else. His mother inspecting a pot, his father disputing the quality of foreign beer, his sister distrusting the sea, the fish seller, the old spice merchant, the woman carrying water, the boy reaching beneath a bench for a reed ball. Maybe those were not lesser Babylons. Maybe they were Babylon itself. The sunlight disappeared. Almost immediately, the air softened. Workers began leaving the quay. A boatman secured his vessel for the night and climbed the bank carrying a small bundle. Somewhere behind them, a cooking fire was lit. The first smoke rose vertically before the breeze took it. Abdi Milk stood. We leave after 3 more mornings. Nabu Ramani had expected several days. 3 mornings sounded shorter. You have not bought enough onions. I will return. Only for onions and the beer. Nabu Ramani looked at him. Abdi Milk smiled. To prove ours is better." They walked away from the river. At the crossing, where their paths divided, neither seemed certain what farewell was appropriate when the departure itself was still 3 days away. So they did not say one. Abdi Milk returned toward the lodging used by Hanno's party. Nabu Ramani turned toward home. Twilight deepened as he entered the residential lanes. He knew every bend, every familiar wall, every place where the packed earth rose slightly beneath his sandals. Yet tonight he looked at them as though he too were a traveler with only 3 mornings left in Babylon. He passed the sandal repairer, now packing away his tools. He passed the doorway where the baby had cried earlier. He passed the place where the donkeys had blocked the street. Nothing had changed. That was precisely why it seemed precious. When Nabu Ramani reached his family's door, he rested his hand upon the wood before opening it. Beyond lay the courtyard. Beyond the courtyard, the roof. Beyond the roof, the stars. And beyond Babylon's walls stretched roads leading toward mountains, deserts, rivers, harbors, and a sea so wide that the opposite shore vanished from sight. For the first time in his life, Nabu Ramani understood that he could love his city completely and still wonder what waited beyond it. The courtyard was dim when Nabu Ramani stepped inside. His mother had already lit a small lamp. Its flame trembled whenever the evening air moved through the house, throwing gentle shadows across the plastered walls. His father sat near the doorway with a tablet resting beside him. His sister was arranging her hair again with the bone pin. Nobody asked immediately where Nabu Ramani had been. That was one of the comforts of home. A person could return carrying thoughts too large to explain and still be handed bread. He ate quietly. Later, on the roof, he looked west. He could not see Abdi Milk's sea. He could not see the mountains through which merchants traveled, nor the towns where they exchanged animals, hired guides, waited for companions, and listened for news about roads ahead. Babylon surrounded him too completely. Its roofs extended beneath the stars. Its walls enclosed neighborhoods, temples, workshops, palaces, gardens, storehouses, streets, and people whose lives overlapped without ever fully meeting. Somewhere, a woman was rocking a child to sleep. Somewhere, a scribe worked by lamplight because a tablet had to be finished. Somewhere, a baker was already preparing for morning. Somewhere, a priest performed duties within a temple court hidden from Nabu Ramani's view. At the river, night watchmen and boatmen listened to water moving against hulls. At the gates, travelers arrived too late to enter or prepared to continue at first light. And beyond those gates lay everything he did not know. Nabu Ramani slept beneath that thought. The following 2 days passed without anything that a royal chronicle would have considered worth recording. Bel Eden received goods. Nabu Ramani wrote tablets. A customer disputed the quality of some wool and eventually bought it anyway. 1 jar of oil leaked. A delivery of dates arrived earlier than expected. Abdi Milk appeared occasionally between errands with Hanno. Once he brought Nabu Ramani a small piece of carved wood from the west. It was not valuable. That made Nabu Ramani like it more. His sister asked whether it had come from beside the sea. Abdi Milk said that perhaps it had. His father immediately wanted to know what kind of wood it was. Nobody knew. On the evening before the caravan's departure, the 2 young men walked once more along the Euphrates. Neither spoke much. There was nothing particularly solemn about the occasion. Boats still moved. Porters still carried baskets. The river had no interest in farewells, Abdimilk had purchased several Babylonian goods for himself, including dates despite his earlier claims that he had come only to observe ordinary food. Nabu Ramani reminded him of this. I observed them carefully. You bought an entire basket. I required further study. Nabu Ramani accepted the explanation. At the place where they had previously sat above the quay, Abdimilk stopped. Tomorrow his caravan would leave early enough to avoid the worst heat. Their road would take them beyond Babylon's cultivated surroundings, through a chain of settlements and stopping places toward lands that Nabu Ramani knew only imperfectly. The journey would not be quick. Ancient travel rarely was. People measured distance partly in days. A river journey depended upon current, wind, craft, and season. A caravan depended upon animals, water, weather, terrain, safety, and the health of everyone involved. The ancient world was connected, but connection required patience. Abdimilk looked toward the darkening water. Will you ever come west? Nabu Ramani had thought about the question since their meal in his family's courtyard. He could have said yes. It would have sounded courageous. He could have said no. It might have been more realistic. Instead, he answered, perhaps. Abdimilk nodded. Perhaps was large enough. Before dawn the next morning, Nabu Ramani left his house. His mother had prepared bread for him. Then, after a moment's consideration, she wrapped additional bread for Abdimilk. His father pretended not to notice how much she gave away. His sister sent one final message. Tell him our beer is better. I think he remembers. Tell him again, Nabu Ramani promised. The streets were still half asleep as he walked toward the northern gate. A faint gray light lay over Babylon. For perhaps the first time since we began following him through the city, he was not hurrying toward work. He simply walked, past the baker beginning his fire, past the walls behind which families slept, past a man carrying water, past a dog curled tightly beneath a doorway. The processional way appeared ahead. In the uncertain light before sunrise, its colors were muted. Then dawn strengthened. Blue returned to the glazed bricks. The sacred animals emerged from shadow. Bulls, mushushu, lions farther along the ceremonial route. Nabu Ramani remembered Abdimilk arriving beneath them. Always blue? Yes, the answer no longer seemed foolish. Perhaps the visitor had been asking whether wonder remained wonder when you saw it every day. Nabu Ramani was not sure. Hanno's caravan waited near the gate. Animals had been loaded. Ropes were being checked. Men adjusted sandals and filled water containers. Travelers counted bundles, then counted them again because experienced merchants trusted counting more than memory. Abdimilk stood beside one of the donkeys. Nabu Ramani handed him the bread. My mother. Abdimilk accepted it with appropriate seriousness. Tell her I will return because of this bread. My sister says you must return because our beer is better. That is why I will not return. Nabu Ramani smiled. Hanno called to his men. There was no long ceremony. Merchants had schedules. Animals had limited patience. Abdimilk clasped Nabu Ramani's forearm briefly. Then he joined the others. The caravan began moving. One donkey resisted for a moment. Nabu Ramani laughed. Even leaving Babylon required negotiation. The animal yielded. The travelers passed beneath the Ishtar gate. Abdimilk looked upward once. Then he turned. He raised one hand. Nabu Ramani raised his own. A few moments later, the caravan had joined the traffic beyond the gate. Soon the men became smaller, then indistinct. Then they were simply travelers on a road. Nabu Ramani remained where he was. Morning spread across the plain. Farmers approached Babylon carrying produce. Laborers headed outward. Another caravan waited to enter. Gate officials spoke to newcomers. The city did not become emptier because one friend had left it. Babylon continued. That was what cities did. Nabu Ramani turned back toward the interior. He walked beneath the blue gate again. This time he looked up. Really looked. Sunlight touched the glazed surface. The animals seemed to move as his angle changed. For years he had passed beneath them while thinking about deliveries, meals, appointments, heat, debts, and unfinished work. Today he allowed himself to be a stranger for several breaths. The gate was magnificent. Beyond it, the processional way opened toward the sacred heart of Babylon. Etemenanki rose above the roofs. Smoke climbed from morning fires. The Euphrates was somewhere beyond the buildings, already carrying boats. Bel Eden would soon be waiting. There would be clay to prepare. There would be quantities to check. There would almost certainly be something wrong with the jar. Nabu Ramani walked toward it all. Around him, Babylon awakened. Bread appeared at stalls. Doors opened. Children emerged. Merchants arranged goods. Temple workers crossed courtyards. Potters shaped clay. Weavers pulled thread through looms. Boatmen pushed from landings. Farmers arrived through gates built by kings. And gradually, almost invisibly, the extraordinary dissolved into the ordinary. Perhaps that was how the greatest cities truly existed. Not as monuments frozen beneath an eternal sun, but as millions of small moments that nobody thought to preserve. A mother judging the price of a pottery jar. A child looking for a lost hairpin. A merchant arguing over a weight. A foreign traveler tasting warm bread. A young scribe pressing wedges into wet clay. We know Babylon partly through what survived. Royal inscriptions tell us how kings wished to be remembered. Temple and administrative records preserve institutions. Contracts reveal property, obligations, families, business, and law. Astronomical tablets preserve generations of patient observation. Archaeology reveals streets, foundations, walls, gates, pottery, and the traces of buildings whose roofs vanished long ago. But much of Babylon disappeared without leaving words. Morning conversations disappeared. Recipes changed. Jokes vanished. Footsteps faded. The smell of a particular household fire rose once into the air and never returned. No tablet recorded the expression of a child seeing the Ishtar Gate for the first time. No archive preserved every tired worker's walk home beside the Euphrates. History keeps fragments. Imagination, when kept carefully within what evidence allows, can help us stand quietly between them. And perhaps tonight, as you rest far from the warm plain of ancient Mesopotamia, Babylon does not need to be the impossible city of legend. It does not need hanging gardens whose location remains debated. It does not need a tower reaching literally into heaven. Its true scale is remarkable enough. There really were monumental walls and gates. There really were temples and palaces. There really were scribes pressing cuneiform into clay. There really were merchants moving goods across extraordinary distances. There really were scholars watching the planets and moon across generations. And there really were ordinary people who woke each morning without knowing that their home would become one of the most famous cities in human memory. For them, Babylon was where the bread was baked, where water was carried, where children played, where business went wrong and was corrected, where the Euphrates moved beneath evening light, where the moon appeared over flat roofs, where strangers arrived beneath a blue gate, and where, at the end of a long day, people climbed into bed while the city continued murmuring beyond their walls. Nabu Remani reached Belidine's warehouse. The merchant was already standing outside. "You are late." Nabu Remani looked at the rising sun, then at Belidine. For once, he did not argue. He entered the courtyard, opened his tablet case, and sat down before a fresh piece of clay. Above Babylon, the morning sky brightened. Beyond the northern gate, a caravan moved westward. Along the Euphrates, boats slipped through golden water. And somewhere high over the waking city, birds circled the ancient tower before drifting away across the plain.